All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today. This is our second annual Say Sarcoidosis patient education event. We had an incredible registration this year. I think we had about 230 people register for the in-person event today, and then I believe about 160 online. So outstanding numbers compared to last year, and we hope this continues to grow. For those who have not met me, my name is Kayla Nyakinye. I'm one of the nurse practitioners in the Sarcoidosis clinic here at Hopkins. And I just wanted to go over a few logistics for the day today before I introduce our speakers for the opening remarks. So you guys received bags upon entry at the registration desk. So in there you'll have a folder which has the agenda for the day, the biographies for the speakers, in addition to some additional materials about research studies, clinical trials, and then some information about our support group and our clinic. When you registered as well, if you parked in the garage here, you received a parking ticket. I want you to note that there is an expiration date on there, which is old. And so we had to confirm that they do not expire, and we talked to all the parking attendants, but just in case, when you are leaving, we'll make sure you guys get a number to call us if you have any issue getting out of the garage, but ignore the expiration date on the parking ticket. We are going to be going fairly quickly from session to session. So if you need a restroom break or to get up and stretch your legs, please do that at any time, as we will not have any specific breaks until our lunch break. If you have a question, find one of us who are wearing the Say Sarcoidosis t-shirts and the purple lighted beads, and we should be able to answer your question or direct you to the person who can answer that question for you. For our online participants, we sent out attachments on the Know Before You Go email that has all of the materials that we included in our folders for our in-person attendees. So make sure to click and review those research materials, and you can always send an email to the Say Sarcoidosis email if you have any questions about those materials. If you have, after each session, we're going to be doing a short Q&A portion. So make sure while you're listening to the talks, if you have any questions that come to mind, just write them down, and then someone will be walking around with a microphone at the end of each session to allow for questions for the speakers. And with that, I'm going to bring up Ms. Heidi Junk for our opening remarks. Heidi is one of our founding patient advisory board members. She is also the MC from last year, so I have big shoes to fill. So welcome on up, Heidi.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and it is so great to be here today. And I want to welcome all of you here and welcome everyone online. On behalf of the entire Patient Advisory Board. Thank you so much for coming. And again, as Kayla said, this is our second annual patient education event. I want to give a huge shout out to Larry Franklin, who is the chair of our events committee, and he worked so hard to put today together. I'm looking around and I don't know if I see him in the room right now, but just Larry, you can hear me anywhere. Thank you so much for all of your hard work. And also a huge thanks to everyone on the events committee, to those in the sarcoidosis clinic. There were long and very late hours putting today together. And just a thank you to everyone who volunteered, who fundraised, and who contributed to make today happen. As you can see from the agenda, we have a wonderful list of speakers today, and I just want to thank each of our speakers for taking the time to come today and to be with us and to share from today. So we hope that you're able to be in community with those who are living with sarcoidosis like you, and that you're with people who get it, who know what it's like, and to feel that you are not alone in this. We hope that you feel empowered by the education and the information that you received today, so that we provide and that you get tools to support yourself on your unique journeys. Because as we know, we're all similar, but we're all different in how we experience this disease. Oh, so sorry. Thank you. And also, we want to let you know, not only learn from our wonderful speakers, but that you learn from each other by being together and sharing your stories. And as Dr. Sharp has told us many times, we are stronger together. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Is the microphone doing better? If it's too much, I can step back. Welcome. For those of you who don't know, I'm Michelle Sharp. I'm the co-director of the Johns Hopkins Sarcoidosis Center. And on behalf of our entire team, and Dr. Chen, who is manning the medical ICU today as the attending, we'd like to welcome you to the second annual Say Sarcoidosis education event. I would like to give our patient advisory board, who I see many of our members here in the auditorium, and I know Larry, I think, is still outside manning the table. A special thank you. We learn so much from you all every day. It is very important to our program and our mission that we keep the patients at the center of everything that we do, and our patient advisory board is the North Star for us. And so thank you all. Thank you for this. You all have put this day together, and you've picked the speakers and you've picked the topics, and I am so thankful for your partnership. A little shout out, we have a lot of committees. The advisory board is expanding in their mission and ways that they hope to impact the community. So if you have any interest, there's a table that will be manned today that you can learn how to get involved. I would like to also give a special shout out to our clinical team. Kayla has been, yes, everybody. Kayla, for all of you who know her here and online, is one of our amazing nurse practitioners. She has been in the clinic working till 11 o'clock all week, trying to make sure that this day goes off without a hitch. I am very, very blessed to work with a group of people clinically and on our research team who believe in our mission, and our mission is to support patients living with sarcoidosis and to find a cure. And working together with these individuals who are all here on their day off volunteering, it's just an honor. I'd like to thank our sponsors, and Kayla has set me up perfectly with this. A-Tier is our platinum level sponsor, Zentria and A&I Pharmaceuticals are gold level sponsors, and a very big shout out to Life and Breath, who will be here today with us. The Life and Breath Foundation is the oldest sarcoidosis foundation dedicated to supporting patients living with sarcoidosis in the United States, established in 1998, and from local here in Baltimore, and we have been growing together and trying to work together because we are better together to support patients living with sarcoidosis. I'd also like to give a special shout out, and I'm trying to see if Becca is here or if she's doing something, to Erin Leonard Events with Becca and Karina, who have been supporting us, and Kayla to get the event going, and are a wonderful caterer, Office Catering. And with that, I have more, that's me. This is our agenda. We will keep reminding you of this, but this is what your morning will look like. And for those of you online, this is what to expect. Our afternoon is shown here. And without further ado, because I have a red mark here, I'm going to introduce a colleague and a good friend, Dr. Kathy Bonham. Dr. Bonham directs the Sarcoidosis and Interstitial Lung Disease Center of Excellence at the University of Virginia. She is an author on the guidelines for diagnosis in sarcoidosis, and her research focuses on the role of the immune system in sarcoidosis and how barriers to accessing care affect patient outcomes. Dr. Bonham has always loved to read, and she especially enjoys bedtime stories with her 4 children. She is a friend, a colleague, and a role model, and I'm so thankful for her donating her time to be with us today. Welcome, Dr. Bonham.
Thank you, everyone, for this wonderful introduction. Heidi, Michelle, the whole team. I just want to express so much joy and gratitude for being here with you today. You're still helping me right now. Great. And hello to everyone at home. How exciting is it that we get to reach you even when you're in your slippers at home, maybe with your coffee. And I've never actually also had to give a talk where someone is giving me a sign language interpretation. I think that's fantastic, and that's new for me too. So here we are together. So our work today with this segment is to understand and give a little bit of an overview of sarcoidosis. So what I am going to go through today, well, first I'm expressing my joy, is the immune system, and talking a little bit about how sarcoidosis is an immune system disease. I'll go over a little bit about the diagnosis of sarcoidosis, how we monitor patients or think about how to manage the disease after diagnosis, and then I'll touch very briefly on treatment, although we have some fantastic speakers coming up who are going to devote a nice long period of time to treatment, and so I'm not going to do a ton on that. So I think about sarcoidosis as a disease in which we really have to understand how the immune system is built in order to understand why we have sarcoidosis and how to approach the disease. So when I talk about the immune system, what I think about is we have this incredible system that's developed inside our body to protect us against different challenges that might injure us. So I'm talking about things like bacteria or virus, fungus, dirt, foreign particles. And what our immune system has done for us is develop different defense strategies to approach these different challenges, and I'll go through some of those. What sarcoidosis is fundamentally is a malfunction of one of these immune defense strategies, and that results in an overactivation of that strategy and ultimately a disease state like sarcoidosis. So if that already is sounding a little bit dry to you, I'm going to show you this picture, which is an actual color picture of your immune system. So these are the little microscopic cells that are floating around in your body, and they're detecting things like bacteria, virus, and other things. And they have to figure out, your immune system has to know, what is good and what is bad. And when I look at this picture, it kind of reminds me of Star Wars, you know? It looks like the Death Star, and there's all the little things flying around, maybe trying to, you know, it's war in there, right? So let's say you're challenged by something like a bacteria or a virus. Example, like flu season, right? Influenza. So your immune system has a very specific response to this sort of thing. It knows that it can get rid of it and get rid of it completely. And so what your immune system tries to do in those situations is to search that out and tag it with something called an antibody and get rid of it. It uses these things called B cells and antibodies to do that. But when the B cells or the antibodies go wrong, kind of a malfunction of that weapon, you get a disease state that's called autoimmunity, okay? And there are some autoimmune diseases, there are many of them, but some tend to overlap with sarcoidosis. So some of you may have experienced this, but some autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, thyroiditis, psoriasis, and others, will be a result of this type of problem with the immune system, where instead of recognizing and destroying something that is a threat to you, an invader, it starts to recognize a part of your own body and attack that. Now that we've talked about that, that's one of the strategies we have. There's another strategy. So sometimes we have a challenge to our immune system where we can't get rid of it, okay? This is something that happens for some types of slow-growing bacteria, like a tuberculosis. Can happen in some types of fungus, and it can happen in some types of non-alive particles, like if you breathe in a foreign something, a piece of sand. And this is the response that sarcoidosis comes from, all right? So the goal here is we can't really get rid of it, like with an antibody, but we can kind of wall it off. We can encapsulate it and surround it. This picture in black and white at the left is showing that, where all the little cells come together and they make a surrounding structure. And those little cells are called T cells and macrophages, so they're different than the autoimmune cells. And when those go wrong, we have a group of diseases called, in scientific terms, a granulomatous disease. So sarcoidosis is a granulomatous disease. Now, this is a family of diseases, so when you are diagnosed with sarcoidosis, we have to figure out, do you have one of these other things? So I'm talking about things like, fancy words here, hypersensitivity pneumonitis, which comes from exposures to birds or mold, silicosis, which is a type of disease that you get when you're breathing in silica or sand. And then sometimes we rule out all those other things like fungus and other triggers. And when we don't know the trigger and we see under the microscope these clusters of cells, that's the immune system response, we have the disease that we call sarcoidosis. Okay? So I'll stop there, and I know that's a lot of information. I don't know if anyone wants to ask me questions. I want you to know that you can stop me and raise your hand at any time. Okay. And I'm trying not to lean into the microphone, but I get excited.
I do have a question.
Yes.
Told me it's not an autoimmune disease, it's an immune dysfunction disease. I mean, what do I tell people? Do I tell them autoimmune? Do I say immune dysfunction? What do I say?
I think what I talk about sarcoidosis as.
Can you repeat the question for the live?
Yes. So the question is, what do we talk about sarcoidosis then when people ask us? Is it an autoimmune disease? Do we say it's an immune dysfunction? I think to lay people, it's very similar to an autoimmune response. Although if we're being really technical, we talk about it as a hyperactive immune response. So it's an immune disease where your immune system is fighting against you and it's overactivated. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. All right. So just to drive home that point, I talked about a word called granuloma. And if any of you have... Oh, yes, of course.
So I have a question. Can you a little bit tell me what it means non-alive particle? And let's say was the COVID vaccine considered something like that? Because my uveitis showed up 2 months after the COVID vaccine.
So the question is, can things like the COVID vaccine trigger sarcoidosis? So since COVID, when everyone has been vaccinated, we haven't seen overall in the population higher rates of sarcoidosis. So we don't think it is a direct effect. However, we don't know exactly for many people what changed their immune system in a way that it became overactivated. So you are not alone in the experience of having something that happened just before you develop sarcoidosis that maybe created an immune response. And so I think that in some people it is possible that exposures to different things create an elevated immune response that then becomes later recognized as sarcoidosis. I don't think there's a direct link, though, between COVID vaccination and sarcoidosis. I do generally recommend vaccinations for all my sarcoidosis patients. I make sure that they're protected against diseases like COVID, because for sarcoidosis patients, getting those diseases can be very harmful. All right. So I spoke a little bit about a word called a granuloma. So one way if you want to think about what is a granuloma, that's a microscopic structure that is seen on patients who have a biopsy for their sarcoidosis. And something that you can hold in your hand is a pearl. When an oyster has a particle of sand caught in it, it makes a pearl to surround the piece of sand. And on a microscopic level, this is what's happening in the immune system when it's confronted with something that it can't get rid of. So you can think about a granuloma kind of like a pearl, and that's what we see on the sarcoidosis biopsies. In medical diagrams, it looks something like this. So there's this big cluster of cells. It has a very specific structure. And on the left of your right, my left, you'll see kind of in pink there what it looks like under the microscope. Okay. So key points about the immune system here. So first of all, it's a defensive weapon. It's here to protect you. The granulomas are the search and surround defensive approach of the immune system. And sometimes we get hit by friendly fire in our immune system. And when that happens, we have things like autoimmunity and granulomatous disease. And there are many granulomatous diseases. So when you have a biopsy or when you're getting a diagnosis of sarcoidosis, one thing your doctors or your team is looking for very carefully are all of these alternative diagnoses that might be alternative diagnosis to sarcoidosis, okay? They're doing special stains on those biopsies, they're doing blood work maybe, and they're asking you a lot of questions often about maybe where you lived, what kinds of occupations you had, and that helps them know whether or not you have a probability of having something else. When they find that you don't have anything else, that is, there is no other trigger found on the biopsy or other testing, then we're talking about a diagnosis of sarcoid. Okay. And then to drive home the point, sarcoidosis is really an overactivity and a malfunction of this granuloma defensive approach. Okay. So, why did my immune system develop this? This is kind of $1 million question. Dr. Montgomery, who is talking right after me, is an expert in genetics, and so I'm going to let her talk a lot about the genetic question. We know for all human disease that our genes, what we inherit from our parents, interacts with our environment to produce the person that we are. And so in sarcoidosis, there are individuals who have inherited genes that seem to make their immune system more likely to develop sarcoidosis. We know that. But it's not present in all patients, and it's not even present sometimes in families who have sarcoidosis. Those are rare. For most people, sarcoidosis exists in one person in the family and not others. However, what we've come to understand is that some of the genes for the immune system may have made it more likely for them to develop sarcoidosis. And Dr. Montgomery and others are researching that really intensely right now, so we learn more every year. Environment. So another huge question for a lot of people is, what is the role of the environment around me? Was there something maybe that triggered my sarcoidosis or that made it more progressive? And what can I do about that? So again, we don't know exactly the trigger for sarcoidosis. And for many people, this may be different triggers. That's very possible. There are research groups that talk about different triggers as possibilities. For example, some types of slow-growing bacteria, they're called mycobacteria, or other triggers. There have some individuals that have looked, for example, at triggers in military veterans. We know, for example, that some individuals that have occupational exposures, military or civilian firefighters, have more sarcoidosis as well. So there was definitely something going on with the interaction of the environment and sarcoidosis. We don't yet know exactly what the thing is that sets that sarcoidosis off. I think there are additionally several groups, including a really strong group here at Hopkins that's led by Dr. Lin, that are looking at things like pollution as a potential driver of people who have sarcoidosis of the lungs that tends to be worse. And I'm a lung doctor, so what I advise my patients always with any lung condition, but especially sarcoidosis, is that you really want high air quality anytime that you have any lung condition. And so it is smart to look around you and say, you know, am I in a home that has anything that makes the air less quality than it could be? Is there smoke in my home? Do I have dust, mold, or other triggers? And then we also take a hard look at what other things can we change. Sometimes individuals have jobs, for example, with a lot of smoke and other dust exposure. Is there something we can change there to make them feel better? That's not something now where I can say we can cure sarcoidosis by changing air quality, but I think we can definitely change symptoms and make them better when we make sure that we're breathing really clean air. Another common question for individuals that have sarcoidosis is, why are there so many symptoms? You know, there are some medical problems where it really just affects one part of my body, and unfortunately for sarcoidosis, it truly can affect all different places. And the overarching thought to that is that since this is an immune system disorder, it really is built to defend the whole body. Your immune system has to be everywhere. And that's why it can impact one or more organs. So about 90% of people do have sarcoidosis of the lungs. That's frequently there around the time of diagnosis. There are some that can have cardiac sarcoidosis, and that sometimes is quite severe. Some of the things that can be very important to find, especially around the time of diagnosis, is whether or not there's eye involvement. Joints, nervous systems, skin, all those things are things that your sarcoidosis team has to make sure that you're adequately screened for so that we can approach those problems in the clinic. And I think we can't forget that there's a lot of whole body symptoms. So it can be difficult to connect symptoms like fatigue or pain or depression or exhaustion with sarcoidosis, but really these are the things that affect our quality of life. And it is just as important as particular organ involvement. And sometimes these things can be treated more effectively with non-medication treatment than anything else. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And my colleague, Dr. Oji, who will be speaking later this afternoon, will also be speaking about treatment. We have to be careful about some of the medications that we use with the expectation of achieving things like help for chronic neuropathy symptoms. So that's numbness and tingling of your extremities, of your legs or your arms, which can sometimes develop in sarcoidosis. Our current medications are not very good at treating that, okay? And sometimes also these whole body symptoms like fatigue are also difficult to treat with the immune changing therapies we have, the immune suppressives. That means that we have to look outside of taking a medication for those and work with our team to find alternative strategies, so exercise, sleep, good nutrition. Okay. Before I get into diagnosis, I just wanted to stop again and make sure everyone is feeling they're getting their questions answered. We good? Okay. All right, diagnosis. So I was really proud of being able to be part of the committee that made a diagnostic guideline for sarcoidosis. One hadn't come on to the scene in about 20 years, since 2020 when this came out. And so we got together as a group to talk about how best to make this diagnosis in a disease where there isn't as much published evidence as some other medical diseases. And what the diagnosis really rests on is that sarcoidosis is truly a multi-system disease. So for many people, this means that they may have, for example, lung involvement, and then also changes in the lymph nodes that drain the lungs. That would be 2 places in the body. Or for some people, it's eyes and some skin. So what it is that we're making sure that we have a disease that fits what we know is sarcoidosis, that we're not missing or making a wrong diagnosis by mistaking one disease for another. And then the other thing that's actually really important for diagnosis is to ensure that we feel confident that it truly is a diagnosis of granulomatous inflammation. That means for many patients, a biopsy is needed. And frequently we're looking at things like lymph nodes or a skin biopsy to make that diagnosis. Now, not every patient is good to biopsy for different reasons. Sometimes a biopsy is not done because it's not really safe. Sometimes there isn't a good site to biopsy. And sometimes a patient, it's just not within their wishes to undergo a procedure. And so in those cases, we have to make kind of an expert opinion diagnosis, looking at the whole person and deciding, do they fit this pattern of sarcoidosis? Is this truly where we have ruled out other problems? And so there is space there within the guideline to make that diagnosis. The most important diseases that we want to really exclude when we're thinking about a sarcoidosis diagnosis are things like cancer and infection, and then other granulomatous disease. So, how do we make this diagnosis? So, I put Dr. House up there. There's that show. He's always talking about sarcoidosis, right? I think he finally makes the sarcoidosis diagnosis, but it's like in the 4th season. So I mentioned lots of lung and lymph node involvement in many patients. Some patients have very specific things or patterns that physicians or providers that you see have to be able to recognize. So there are some patients who have skin involvement, and that can be seen on a biopsy as well. I always worry about the young people especially that develop cardiac disease without any other apparent cardiac manifestations like coronary artery disease, and they're getting problems with rhythm or heart failure, and cardiac imaging can help us a lot with that. Other patterns for sarcoidosis that are common are inflammatory eye disease, high calcium levels with kidney stones, or even paralysis of a side of the face that's called Bell's palsy. And this would be one example, right, where I teach our students, a patient comes in with a rash that looks like this on their legs. Well, what could that be? So this, for example, is one of the really classic syndromes of sarcoidosis. It has a name called Lofgren's, and it is this funny leg rash along with the sarcoidosis typical chest x-ray, and then also some ankle swelling and pain. And that's actually a very common presentation, a common case of someone who gets sarcoidosis, particularly in Scandinavian populations. There's some genetics behind that. And when people come with this particular syndrome, that actually has a pretty good prognosis. So we try to recognize that. More often, though, the diagnosis is more like this. So, and many of you may have experienced this, where you get some maybe abnormal chest imaging or a scan, and someone says, hey, we've got lymph nodes that are enlarged. Lymph nodes are these little shadows on your chest x-ray. And we say, oh, wow, why are those enlarged? Could you have maybe cancer? Could you have an infection? Or sometimes they'll see a nodule in the lungs. And so this is, unfortunately, a very scary way to learn you have sarcoidosis. Unfortunately, it's also very common, right? Where someone tells you first you might have cancer, and we need to go do some biopsies there. And then, through the course of the diagnosis, you eventually come to see sarcoidosis. Another common way that people get diagnosed is the nodules on the chest x-ray or shortness of breath. And one question that I get for patients a lot in clinic is specifically related to the x-ray stages of sarcoidosis. So let me go through that. There's a little detour here, but sarcoidosis x-rays are sometimes categorized in 1 through 4. It's actually a little similar to the way if you have individuals in your family maybe that have a cancer diagnosis, they'll talk about, having stages of cancer with 4 being the worst. Sarcoidosis, for better or for worse, also has stages 1 through 4 on chest x-rays. And so if you read your notes, sometimes people will talk about, I have a stage 1 chest x-ray, I have a stage 4 chest x-ray. So this was a system that was developed in the early 1960s by a doctor called Dr. Scatting in England. And what he basically did was he took about 100 patients, sarcoidosis patients, and he decided to make the x-rays categorized 1 through 4. And he said stage 1 is really early. That means that just their lymph nodes are big. Stage 2 and 3 means there's something going on in the lungs. And then stage 4 means that there's a little bit of scar starting to happen in the lungs. So that means that stage 1 is early. Stage 4 is later because you've had some time to develop scar. But importantly, I think when he made those stages, he really thought about them perhaps as things that happen sequentially in time. Since then, we have not found that that is true. So patients who have treatment-worthy symptoms or progressive and relapsing disease might have an x-ray anywhere between 1 and 4. Your symptoms also might not match your chest x-ray. I have patients who have abnormal chest x-rays and they say, Doc, I go biking every day. I feel pretty good. I would not treat a patient like that. Even if their chest x-ray is abnormal, their disease might be kind of quiet. So we really have to balance what we see on imaging and how the patient feels. All right. And if you read your reports and you see a stage 2, 3, 4, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are extremely progressive and things are getting worse. You have to talk to your providers about it, but it truly has to be a personalized approach. I mentioned biopsies, so a lot of people do get lymph node biopsies nowadays. I always look for skin findings first before we do anything more invasive. Why? Because it's just so much better to have a little skin biopsy than to go through a bigger procedure. So this is an example of sarcoidosis that has affected a patient's tattoos. Sometimes I can feel this as little lumps and bumps under the skin more than we can see it. What it then looks like under the microscope is something like this. So you can see there on the left side of your screen what the tattoo looks like, and it has that kind of lumpy, bumpy quality. When we take a biopsy, this is actually what the dermatologist wrote me. Pathology perfect for sarcoid, and they're always so perky. My friends in dermatology, so perky. Great photos here. They're showing the tattoo pigment. That's the little black spots there under the skin, plus the granulomas. So there you have it. So that was a way that it was a young gentleman who had this. And so we were able to do just the biopsy of a little area on his arm, didn't have to put him through a big scope to do lymph node biopsies inside the chest. So that's all about diagnosis. After diagnosis, when you're seeing your sarcoidosis team, maybe for the first time after a biopsy, they may talk to you a lot about different screening. So detection of or taking care of sarcoidosis also means we have to be vigilant for sarcoidosis affecting body outside of where you were originally diagnosed. So there are some things that are generally done at the time of diagnosis to screen you. For example, in cardiac disease, we always want to ask about symptoms and everybody really should have a 12-lead EKG to make sure that the rhythm of your heart is okay. If you're having symptoms, usually you're going to need a little bit more advanced cardiac imaging. So starting out with an echocardiogram, but typically also proceeding to a cardiac MRI or even a special sarcoidosis protocol cardiac PET. And anyone who's had the PET can tell you all about the special diet that they do for that. Another screener that should be done for everybody is to go visit a great eye doctor looking for inflammation in the back of your eye. Everybody should have some chest imaging, even if they just diagnosed a spot on the skin, and everybody should have a lung function test. We also do some blood work to look for other organ involvement and usually some urine tests. And then for our clinic that I run, I'm also assessing a few other things related to quality of life, mental health, and sleep apnea. And I think that's just really important to take care of the whole person. You will see a little bit of variation between sarcoidosis centers in terms of how aggressive they are with screening, especially with the more advanced cardiac imaging in someone who doesn't have any heart symptoms. but definitely the EKG and the screening questions are really important. Okay, so treatment. I'm starting to run out of time, so I'm going to run through really fast. My colleague, Dr. Oji, in the afternoon will go through treatment more. One of the treatments that we do a lot is prednisone. If you've been on prednisone before, you know there's lots of side effects. We don't want you to get stuck on long-term steroids, and I think that's really important and something that is really we're hammering on in the field to get people off of steroids. I think non-steroid treatment is increasingly used as first line or as early as possible. Really important, I think, to consider the role of physical exercise, both in your physical health as well as your mental health. There have been specific studies in this, and sarcoidosis patients really can see an improvement with regular exercise. And then mental health, wellness and nutrition, adequate sleep, always important for everybody. Develop that great relationship with your team. These are my key points, and I would love to take a few questions.
Hello everyone, my name is Kristen Mathias. I'm one of the new physicians who has recently joined the Sarcoidosis Center. I have the distinct pleasure this morning of introducing Dr. Courtney Montgomery as our next speaker. Dr. Montgomery is the director of the Center for Biomedical Data Sciences, a professor in the Genes and Human Disease Research Program at the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation, and an adjunct professor in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at the University of Oklahoma Health Science Center. She has been engaged in complex disease research for over 20 years, with a strong focus on translational research, particularly genetics and genomics. She leads a laboratory focused on the immunogenetics of sarcoidosis, serving as the director of the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation's Sarcoidosis Research Unit. Her talk today will be titled, How Genetics Can Help Us Understand Sarcoidosis. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Montgomery.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a huge honor, and I was even more honored when I found out just this morning that I was selected by patients. That's amazing. Thank you. I've been a part of a few sarcoidosis patient events before, and I'm always like, it's like a love fest, right? I mean, this is just such an amazing community. All of the clinicians, which you guys have phenomenal ones here in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, and they're so dedicated to the field, and we just all love you guys, and thank you for your participation. So, as Dr. Bonham said, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. I'll try to pause as we do, but certainly I've left plenty of time for questions at the end as well. So I just want to talk a little bit about genetics, conflict of interest, nothing that pertains to this presentation, except doggone it, I left all of my purple attire in my closet at home, and I was really mad when I showed up, and Dr. Bonham had on her beautiful purple coat, and I'm like, dang it. So anyway, all right, so what do we know about sarcoidosis? And you've already heard a lot about this morning. Thank you for the amazing setup to Dr. Bonham. We know that both genetics and the environment are important. They both play a role. We also know, as you heard, sarcoidosis is a dysregulated immune response in response to an unknown antigen. So we still aren't sure what that trigger is, right? But we know that something is initiating that response. So how then can we use genetics to help us know what's causing sarcoidosis, or better yet, how to treat it? And will my family members have it? This is something that I often get asked as patients come through my research clinic. So that's what we're going to start with. So how do we know genetics are involved? Well, first of all, we see the frequency of sarcoidosis enriched in certain populations. You heard mention of certain Scandinavian populations that have a higher incidence of Lofgren syndrome. We also know that people of African ancestry in the United States, particularly in the American South, have higher incidence of sarcoidosis. But also we can look within family members and we can say, okay, when we look at families, do we see the same proportion of people also having sarcoidosis versus selecting people at random from the population? And we see that higher frequency in relatives. There's also been some very early comparisons of monozygotic, which is identical twins, compared to dizygotic or non-identical twins, and we see an increase incidence of sarcoidosis in the identical twins than we do in the twins that are not identical. And we, as I mentioned, the frequency across populations across the world. But this is not a definitive thing. It's not, well, if I have sarcoidosis, then absolutely my sibling or my children will have it. And so why is that? Well, sarcoidosis, as you all know as patients, is not simple, right? Well, it's not simple on the genetic side either. So there's things that we call monogenic diseases, and those are things where if you have a mutation in this particular gene, you will have disease. Most of those are things that are diagnosed very, very early in life, something that we see in babies. It is very obvious. It usually results in systemic or whole body issues, very easily identifiable. There are a couple of diseases like sickle cell that have genetic variants that if you have them, you are likely to have disease, but the variability, the severity of that disease may differ, so they aren't quite monogenic, but close. But sarcoidosis, like most other complex diseases, particularly autoimmune or immune-regulated diseases, is not like that. There are probably hundreds of genes involved. Okay, but don't be disheartened. Don't be disheartened, because learning more about the genes involved helps us. Even just a few of them, right? We don't have to necessarily pinpoint every single gene that's involved. And so what you see up here is just sort of a representation of what our DNA looks like, right? So we're all just comprised of A's and T's and C's and G's. And we can look at each one of our DNA strands. We now have the ability, technology has advanced significantly since I started, and we can do whole genome sequence is what it's called. And we can see every single piece of your DNA. And we can compare those within patients, compared to other diseases, compared to people who don't have an immune-regulated disease, and say, aha, we are finding differences. And so that's sort of where things started. But as I mentioned, we know that it's not just about the genetics. So when we think about sort of this course or progression of disease, and this isn't really unique to sarcoidosis, but certainly applies, we start off with sort of normal immunity. We're just rocking along, everything is going good, right? And then maybe we have what we call sort of a benign immune response. So we, have a case of the flu. We are exposed to, some mold in the place that we work, whatever it is. We don't really know it. We don't feel any different. Everything seems fine. But in the background, those genetics are at play, right? So our body is fine-tuned to respond unique to us and unique to our genetic code. And then let's say we get another environmental exposure. And these may accumulate over time. You heard Dr. Bonham talk about higher prevalence in certain fields in the military or firefighters. So maybe after repetitive exposure, the genetics really kick in and we have an actual pathogenic response and ultimately leads to clinical disease. So it's all sort of playing at work, okay? So that's just sort of laying the foundation. So then how can understanding this genetic influence help us understand what's happening in the environmental influences as well? So I'm going to stop for a minute, and I'm going to give like a little bit of a, or I'm going to shift gears for a minute, and I'm going to give a little bit of a lesson in genetics. So bear with me. So I told you that we can look at your genetic sequence, okay? We all have one genetic sequence. It doesn't matter whether I take the hair out of your hairbrush, whether I take a swab from your cheek cells, whether I take a blood sample. I can determine your DNA, okay? The DNA is the same no matter where I take it from. But what that DNA does or how it expresses itself is very context dependent, okay? That's how we get things like muscle cells and skin cells and nerve cells. Same DNA, but it expresses itself differently, okay? All right, so as you saw previously, the immune system is what is involved in making granulomas. So just like the DNA expresses itself differently in nerves versus skin versus muscle, it expresses itself differently in all those cells that make up the immune system. And there's a lot of them because our immune system is super complex and super fine-tuned, which is an amazing thing when we need it, right, to help us get over infections and so forth. But in the case of sarcoidosis, as you well heard, something's gone awry. So what we can do now is use that DNA and use how it's expressing itself to understand what a cell is saying. And we can actually identify which cells are sort of at work, which cells are overexpressing themselves, which cells are kind of laying in the background and not saying much, and compare that in sarcoidosis patients to people without disease, or even in sarcoidosis patients who resolve disease compared to those that have very progressive or aggressive disease. All right. The other thing that we can do is we can take these cells, we can put them in the laboratory, and this is where the environmental piece comes in, and we can stimulate those immune cells with things like cigarette smoke or sort of artificial smog or certain bacteria products, etc. And we can say, how do those cells respond, okay? How is their DNA expressing itself differently when it comes in contact with some of these environmental exposures? So that's just sort of what I'm depicting here is, let's say, on the side closest to me, this is what we see. This is kind of the pattern how the DNA is expressing itself without stimulation. But then when we stimulate it, oh wow, things start lighting up all over the place. And it can begin to give us clues not only to what genes are involved in disease, but how those genes might, like I said, change in the way that they're expressing themselves in presence of given environmental exposures. Okay, I'm going to stop for a minute because I've just said a whole lot. So let's all deep breath, me too. And if you have if there's any questions at this point, I'm happy to take them. Okay, so finally, how can we use genetic knowledge to improve diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment? Because hopefully the word of encouragement is that I can give you is that even if we don't understand who knows how many triggers there are, maybe there's hundreds of different triggers and they're going to be unique to each person. If we understand what those triggers are doing, what they are doing to our cells, how they are causing those genes to express themselves differently, we can target that, right? We don't have to know. We don't have to answer every question. We just have to answer some of the most important ones. And so one of the things that we're working on is identifying changes in immune cell profiles. Like I said, now we have the technology where I can take a blood sample from any one of you and I can actually look at each individual cell in that sample. I can identify what that cell is, and I can say how is it different either in number compared to someone else. So in this little picture I'm showing you, for example, we saw that our control samples have far more B cells, certain kind of immune cell, than the people with mild disease versus severe disease, but I can also ask not just do you have differences in number, but do you have differences, like I said, in how excited these cells are, right? So maybe whatever that trigger is just exciting certain cells differently, and can we then target those specific cells? Because as you guys well know, a lot of the treatments for sarcoidosis are like, we don't know which cell's acting ugly, so we're just gonna tell them all to shut up. And that's not great, right? So these are the kinds of things that we're trying to do, is to make anything we can do to make the treatments more precise is a win. So we can also use genetic effects to help predict what organs we think will be involved. So this is, again, a paper we published about 1.5 years ago, where we actually did see that certain genetic profiles, if you will, we could group patients and say, oh, patients who have these groups of organs involved are more likely to share genetics than people with certain other involvement. But you see here, there's a fair amount of overlap too. So it's not perfect, but again, it's just a small win for us. So finally, I think, as was mentioned about the particular genetics of folks with Wolfram syndrome, which tends to be a self-resolving disease. So we're actually trying to learn more about those people and looking at these protective genetic effects to give us insight. So maybe if we could translate what's happening in this sort of special case of disease that gets better, then maybe we could apply that to all sarcoidosis patients. And we can also learn from other diseases. So sarcoidosis, people still consider it somewhat a rare disease. And so maybe there's not as many in the sarcoidosis community pursuing answers as there are in diseases like lupus, for example. So again, some of the work that we've done is, can we find similarities at the genetic level and otherwise between sarcoidosis patients and other autoimmune or immune-mediated disease patients? And can we borrow from that knowledge? Because, hey, if they've got, 10 times more people working on it, we can learn from what they're doing as well. And finally, I just want to plug for computational advances are speeding things along. I love to show this picture in Oklahoma because everybody knows what it is, because we're Tornado Alley, and this is actually a Doppler radar. But some of the same algorithms that we use to predict things like tornadoes and say, oh, the tornado is going to be in this town at 9:05 and this town at 9:15 and so forth, we're applying to things like biopsy samples. And we can learn more about what those cells are doing within the sort of spatial context of their tissue and making some prediction about cells moving around and how that might influence sarcoidosis. So, and finally, wouldn't it all be a dream for all of us if we could get to the point where we have a blood test, we can look at proteins that can help us diagnose disease, but also how to prognose disease. In other words, predict whether someone is going to have severe or progressive disease and help guide treatments there as well. All right, so my acknowledgement, and see there I have my purple, and so does all my team. But huge thank you to lots of people that have been involved with our work, and most importantly, again, for you guys for having me. So, open for questions.
All right. So thank you, Dr. Montgomery, for that excellent talk and sharing your expertise with us. Up next, we have Sean Hull from Life and Breath Foundation. Dr. Sharp kind of introduced them and thanked them in the beginning of today, but Life and Breath Foundation is a local sarcoidosis foundation that we have been partnering with for years, and our goal is really to work with them to increase awareness for sarcoidosis, share resources for patients and families. So we're super honored to have Sean here with us to give a brief introduction to his foundation and some of the resources that they have available. So.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm not a doctor. I actually work for PNC Bank here in Baltimore. I'm the market leader for the private bank, but that's the job I get paid for, the job that I prioritize more than that job is what I do for the Life and Breath Foundation. Love to be able to tell you a little bit more about the foundation, but first, I'd like to thank Dr. Sharp for putting this together. This is wonderful. My mother passed away with sarcoidosis in 1996. The family didn't know that she was struggling with the disease, and I had to go over. I was fortunate to go over to Johns Hopkins to find out a little bit more about the disease, but I learned she passed away with sarcoidosis from her autopsy. So with that, I spoke with Dr. Moeller, met with him, tried to find out a little bit more about the disease, understood that she struggled for 13 years by herself with the disease. So I put together a plan to do something in her memory, created the Life and Breath Foundation, and then this year is the 27th year that I've been fighting for you guys. Now, if I could find out how to advance. So I would say no one's really ever heard of sarcoidosis back in 1998. They're very few, very hidden. So what I had to do is I tried to figure out how I could expand the awareness. So I like to play golf. So I hosted a golf tournament for the first 10 years at Hayfields Country Club. And that was my journey to build the awareness, build the structural foundation to be able to help people understand what sarcoidosis was. The most important thing I had to do, though, was find patients that had the disease, because you were hiding. You didn't know if you wanted to share that with someone. You were looking for a medical professional to be able to help you understand it a little bit more. And just what you witnessed this morning, there's different questions that need to be answered by different professionals. And the best thing you can do is put together a team, organize yourself with a plan, and then it's about execution and management. So what I did is I established a foundation. I have 3 different things in my mission statement I'm trying to do: providing effective tools for you guys to be able to use, to be able to look at how to maximize the quality of your life, do it in a nurturing environment, helping you understand you're not by yourselves, and then helping to build a bridge between the foundation, you, and the medical professionals. I established and understood I couldn't do it by myself, but that's the way it started. So I created a board of directors, surrounded myself with individuals that were aware of the disease but wanted to help me with the journey. I also thought it was necessary to be able to create a clinical advisory board, medical professionals that could really help me understand what you're going through, what you need, how it can help you, what are the necessary things for us to consider. And then I put together an advisory board, understanding that as we grew, we needed to do it in a professional manner for people to take us seriously. So I wanted to be able to organize myself with leaders in the community that could help me do that. Now, talking about what we do, essentially, so what I mentioned, the first 10 years, we started with a golf tournament. Things were going very well. We raised a lot of money. I was able to donate some money to Johns Hopkins, and then the financial crisis happened, 2008, 2009. Guess what? No more golf tournament. No one has the money to spend towards this. So I had to reconfigure what I was going to do, trying to expand this awareness to more people, and basically you didn't have to play golf to be able to participate. So I created the Flip Flop Festivus. It's a gala event, and I was looking for something that you didn't have to wear a suit, tuxedo, but since we're coming out of the financial crisis, I was looking for something to put a smile on your face. So oftentimes when you go vacation in the Bahamas, Jamaica, things of that nature, think about you, shorts, Tommy Bahama shirt, a cigar, sangria, many of the things, flip-flops. Oh, wait a minute, we need a name for it. Flip-flops, Festivus, Flip-Flop Festivus. But there's only one thing wrong with that. Baltimore Ravens were using this term, Festivus Maximus, because they were on their way to the Super Bowl. Didn't want to say anything about the playoffs, so they replaced that word with Festivus. So I utilized this, invited some of my Ravens friends that have Super Bowl rings, and they joined me for the Flip Flop Festivus Gala. And then I tapped Heidi on shoulder and said, Heidi, would you come join me? Because Heidi, we learned a little bit more about Heidi and her challenges and what she was going through in her journey. And really, I have to say thank you to Heidi, because she's the reason why we created this Life and Breath healthcare tracker. So for many of the things that you just talked about in the first 2 hours here, about all the number of things that you have to be aware of, you have to keep track of, and then you want to be interactive when you meet with your medical professional, the Life and Breath tracker hopes to do that. And so, and I have to keep my hand on this mic and stay in front of the camera, but this is out here. I have it outside on my table, but it's a tracker that's going to not only help you with your journey, and this is really specific to those that are newly diagnosed with it, or those individuals that really want to be more of an advocate for themselves as you go interact with your medical professional. So it'll allow you to track your journey, your lifestyle habits that we just talked about, your symptoms, things you go through each and every day, the medications you're on, so that you have all that in one spot to be able to do what? When you go talk to your medical professional, it's not, let me figure out what you told me the last time. You actually have a medical record of it, and you're able to keep a detailed overview with you. So we're working on it right now. It's a desktop form, but we also have it in paper form. So I think the numbers are up there. It's only 2 years old. We've sent out 850 digital copies, 600 printed copies, and we've reached over 1,200 patients. And look at the countries where we have reached those particular patients. People are reaching out to us. And the reason that we're reaching out to us, my second thing, the reason why the Festivus came to an end is this thing called COVID in 2020 March. So what happened was our patients, you guys, were looking for more information. How can you connect it? How is this COVID going to impact your pulmonary impact, let's say? And then how is the vaccine going to be a challenge also with some of the other medications you're taking up? So we were able to create a Zoom speaker series where we would bring in these medical professionals to be able to talk to you. They're monthly 60-minute Zoom calls, and you would be given an opportunity to Q&A and be able to not only hear different things, because it impacts different organs, right? And then there's different things that we need to talk about: lifestyle, nutrition, mental awareness. I mean, there's various things that we talked about. So we were happy to be able to do that. We also brought in and created our own support group. I didn't ever want to create a support group because in my history with the foundation, many times they were an area where people complained about themselves, complained about their situation, and brought everybody down. And I didn't want that. I wanted it be embracing, uplifting. You're not by yourself. You're actually with the community. We can do it together. We're there for you. But we want to hear from you. We want to hear what you're going through, because maybe somebody else has gone through it. Also, back to the speaker series, we did a talk for the caregivers also, because they're an important part to your team also, to keep them involved. One of the other things we did in terms of our events is coming out of COVID. I'm trying to figure out, the government wouldn't allow us to go out, so I created this virtual 5K so that you could exercise, you could keep that mental awareness and up front. And so we did it digitally, and then we were able to bring it back in person in 2023. We're doing it at Dijon Vineyards. Wouldn't it be great to get up in the morning, bring your family, your stroller, walk a 1K or run a 5K, and then have a glass of wine afterwards to celebrate that? So that was more of a fun thing that you could bring your family, bring your caregiver, be inclusive, and also continue to raise the awareness. And then I brought back the golf tournament naturally, because I like to play golf. All right, it's good. Thank you. One of the other things, again, coming out of COVID is the embrace of social media. There is where we're able to share some of the speaker series that we just talked about on a monthly basis. Some of you are writing down notes and trying to understand what is being shared with you. We thought we'd put the speaker series up, create a YouTube channel, and then on demand you can go through and take a look at some of the information and go at your speed, and you can go back to it. So we have 3 years of those that are online right now, as well as the Instagram and Facebook, just a way that we can disseminate information, be educational in mind. And then we created a newsletter because we have monthly things that are going on that affect you. So it's been a long journey. It's been 27 years. This is what I do. This is my mother. This is how I celebrate Mother's Day. My mother would have turned 88 years old this past August. So I'm hoping she's proud of me. I hope she has the spirit. But I wanted to thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you. It's actually the first time that I've spoke in front of the largest amount of sarcoidosis patients, because I've been looking for you. But I found you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. So we are going to be heading into lunch soon. I have a number of announcements before we do head into lunch. So I have a couple of notes for both our online participants and our in-person participants. So for our in-person participants, some of you stopped by the tables when you were eating breakfast after registration, but we do have a research table set up where you can learn more about the different studies that we have here at Hopkins, both clinical trials, some of our non-clinical trial studies, our registry. You can enroll today in some of the studies, some you can just get information about. We also have a general table. Dr. Sharp mentioned you can learn how to become a part of our committees in our center if you are interested in becoming more involved with our patients. We will be having a photo booth set up in the lunchroom. She is stuck in the cycling traffic, but she will be here shortly. But we have a lot of fun props, and we hope you really guys have a lot of fun with that today. For our online participants, we will have a slide deck, the slide deck that is up, cycling during the lunch period. We want to leave this up so that you guys have the reminder that we will resume the sessions at 1 p.m. If you have any questions, again, find one of us with the purple beads. And we have wonderful speakers who are sticking around for lunch. So if you guys had burning questions that didn't get answered in our earlier sessions today, please find them and ask away. Our lunch, as with breakfast, will be served in this main hall. For those who came a little later, then the eating room is next door, and we have a number of round tables. It was quite packed this morning, which is exciting because we had so many participants. If you want extra dining area, if you go outside here and to the right, there is a whole cafeteria area and additional seating. And if you so want a different cuisine, you can also enter outside there, and there are additional food options. But we have wonderful food options here that we can choose from today. I think that is about all that I have announcements before we break for lunch. Unless anyone has a specific question about lunch activities. All right.
All right, everyone. I extended by 5 more minutes because we were having so much fun at the photo booth. But I want to transition back into our afternoon session. We have a wonderful afternoon that has been planned for you all. We're going to start with a discussion from Dr. Obi on current and emerging treatment in sarcoidosis. We'll go into a guided meditation that I am so pumped about. Last year we did chair yoga. This year we're doing guided meditation. We'll have a discussion on sarcoidosis and fatigue, a discussion on occupational exposures in sarcoidosis, and then we will end with our multidisciplinary sarcoidosis panel and closing remarks. I hope that you had a great lunch, and I hope that you are finding community and getting your questions answered and information to help empower you as you travel your journey with sarcoidosis. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Obi. Dr. Obi is an associate professor of medicine and director of the Sarcoidosis Center of Excellence at East Carolina University. She has pages, actually, of an introduction that I could share with you, and I'm not going to let her go before I share some of it. She is the director of the sarcoidosis program, and she's also internationally renowned sarcoidosis clinician and researcher. She established the East Carolina University Sarcoidosis Registry to better understand and characterize the disease in eastern North Carolina, and has dedicated her life and her career to improving the quality of life for patients living with sarcoidosis. She is a wonderful friend and colleague, and I'm so thankful for her traveling to us to talk with us about current and emerging treatments in sarcoidosis. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharp, for that very, very kind and generous introduction. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm just going to kick it off by saying I like my Say Sarcoidosis t-shirt, and I thank you for the privilege of being able to wear it together with you all today. All right, so I'm going to be talking to us today about current and emerging treatments in sarcoidosis. These are my disclosures, and none of these are relevant to my talk today. So we'll start out with doing a very, very brief overview of sarcoidosis, and then we'll go into the meat of the matter. We'll talk about, current treatments, emerging treatments, why patients are treated in sarcoidosis. We'll round it up, and then we'll open up for some questions and discussions. All right, so sarcoidosis is a chronic granulomatous inflammatory disease of unknown etiology. It's characterized by the presence of non-caseating granulomas that can really affect any part of the body. But honestly, that is really jargon. So the way I, explain it or describe it to my patients is that for reasons that we still don't fully understand, the body's immune system goes into a hyperdrive and forms these clumps or clusters of immune cells known as granulomas. And they can really affect any part of the body. In over 90% of patients, it affects the lungs. So this is a picture of the sarcoid granuloma. You can see that it consists of very well-formed clusters of immune cells. In the middle of the granuloma, you have the macrophages, which are the body's first-line defense against infection, and they're surrounded in the periphery by T cells. Now, about 50% of patients, sometimes more, of patients who are diagnosed with sarcoidosis have complete resolution of their disease. And in a lot of those patients, it doesn't come back. Now, that resolution typically would occur within the first 3 years. By the end of 10 years or thereabouts, another 1/3 of patients, so about 2/3 of patients will have resolution of their disease. But there is a 10 to 20 or 30% of patients who develop chronic debilitating disease with fibrosis and scarring in their lungs and who go on to die from the disease. Mortality from the disease is about 5%. So we don't really know what causes sarcoidosis. We think it has to do with a gene and an environment interaction. So patients who have some genetic predisposition, when they are exposed to certain things in the environment, those things which we label as antigens, they then go on to develop sarcoidosis. I included this slide because I think that it is fundamental to understanding the treatment for sarcoidosis. So just bear with me as I walk us through the slide. So in patients who have this genetic predisposition to developing sarcoidosis, when they are exposed to, again, what we call the sarcoid antigen, it interacts with and activates the body's first line against infection, which are called the macrophages. It activates these macrophages and causes them to produce cytokines, inflammatory cells or inflammatory substances that then go on to upregulate or drive the process of granuloma formation. These cytokines, the chief of which is TNF-alpha, and I mentioned that because we'll talk about that when we go on to treatments. These cytokines then activate T cells, which are the body's second-line defense system, and activated T cells then go on, along with further escalation of this cytokine milieu, to form granulomas. Now, like I said, a lot of patients will resolve their granulomas, but again, genetically predisposed individuals under the influence of more and more of these cytokines have their granulomas continuing to expand and persist, and in 10 to 20% of patients develop fibrosis. Now, certain pathways like the mTOR inhibitor pathway or the JAK pathway have been implicated in fibrosis. You hear those words again later in the presentation. All right, so we don't know what causes sarcoidosis. We can see that it's a very complex interplay of immune cells, but what matters to every single person in this room is that it is a immune disease, and it is real, okay? It affects every single organ, or almost every single organ or body part, and it presents in a gazillion amount of ways. These are all pictures from my patients, and I know that every single patient in this room can relate to at least one photo, maybe even multiple pictures on this slide. Sarcoidosis is associated with increased mortality. So this is a study from Sweden that showed that patients who have sarcoidosis on the average die about 2 years before the general population, and for those who have severe disease, they are about 2-fold more likely to die than the general population. Sarcoidosis affects quality of life, and that is the most important thing to patients, and it causes a lot of angst. So even for patients who don't have severe disease, they live in fear of their disease getting worse or not resolving or not knowing what other organ will be affected. And so for that reason, in the spirit of empowerment, it is absolutely crucial that we all, as a group, understand how to treat sarcoidosis, why we treat sarcoidosis, and the treatment options that are available to us. All right, so we'll start with why and when do we treat sarcoidosis, what physicians commonly refer to as indications for therapy. So this is a paper that was published, it's about 3 years old now, that, kind of revised and put together the indications for treating patients with sarcoidosis. And there are really two major indications for treating sarcoidosis. Indication number one is we want to improve patients' quality of life. Indication number two is we want to avoid danger of organ failure or dysfunction, and we want to minimize risk of dying from the disease. Again, that's really a lot of words. What does that mean? It means really that not every patient with sarcoidosis needs to be treated. It's important that we let that sink in. Now, we think about treating patients, so it's a balancing act, and we want to treat patients who have severe disease. So remember how I talked about scarring or fibrosis in the lungs? When patients are developing fibrosis or scarring, we want to treat them, because that is the #1 killer for patients who have sarcoidosis. When patients start to develop high blood pressure in their heart, what we call pulmonary hypertension, we want to treat those patients, because that's also the second reason for patients dying. Patients who have involvement of their heart, who have involvement of their brain, those are severe manifestations of disease that can be very debilitating. We want to treat those patients. Now, patients who have risk of eye involvement or who have eye involvement or risk of kidney failure, we also want to treat those patients. When patients start to have their lung function declining, that's an indication for treating those patients. And patients who have multi-organ disease or risk of disease progression. Now, bolded is patients who have such severe symptoms that it's affecting their quality of life. So if you can't go out in public, because every time you step in a room, the entire room empties out because you're coughing, that's a reason to treat you. If you can't play with your grandkids or your family because you can barely walk from here to that door, that's an indication for treatment. If you have such devastating skin disease that you feel ashamed to go out in public, that affects your quality of life, that's a reason to treat you. And in looking at these indications for treatment, we want to balance it out with risk. It's important you balance the risks. So you want to look at the side effects and the toxicity of the medicines that we're using. If we're going to treat a disease where the side effects are a whole lot worse than the disease, it's not worth it. We want to look at the risk of developing new diseases, what we call comorbidities, from the medicines that we use. We need to balance out all of those risks. Risk of developing infections from immune suppression, and importantly also, we want to evaluate the likelihood of sarcoidosis resolving. So this is a slide I got from Dr. Craig Rackley. I could never really make anything this good. But essentially, we talk about 4 stages of sarcoidosis now in the lungs, okay? So for patients who have sarcoidosis where it's just involving the lymph glands in their lungs, about 60 to 90% of those patients will have complete resolution of their disease. And so there's really no reason to expose all those patients to side effects from medicine. When we have sarcoidosis starting to affect the lung parenchyma itself, about 40 to 60% would resolve their disease, so you start to talk about symptoms and you start to balance the risks of treatment. Now, this is referring to the lung and assuming they don't have other organ involvement. It's important to state that fact. Now, when they have where they are starting to scar or where they are having significant involvement in their lungs, the likelihood of resolution is less, so those patients are likely to warrant treatment. So again, it's a balancing act. Now, when we do start to treat patients, it's been recommended that we do what we call a stepwise approach. So this is, again, from that publication, and it's listed all the medicines that we use to treat patients with sarcoidosis. And the first medicine that you can see there is prednisone. It's first line. I say that and I cringe, and I'll tell you why in the next few slides. But it is what it is. It's considered first line. I hope over the next few years, months actually, that will change. All right, the next set of medicines are considered second line therapy. Again, those are most methotrexate, leflunomide, azathioprine, and mycophenolate. We'll go through all those medicines. The third line therapies are biologics, the most commonly used one being infliximab. And then again, I have fourth line here. Those medicines haven't really been proven in sarcoidosis, but we do sometimes use them. All right, so steroids are considered first line therapy in patients who have sarcoidosis. They do work, but it's not for no reason that we call them the devil's own candy. So the very first, one of the earliest studies, and I'm just going to present studies that we consider, top quality, randomized controlled trials. Generally, in sarcoidosis, those are very small, but those are usually our highest evidence. So the study, the randomized control study that looked at steroids in patients with prednisone is, over 20 years old now. Essentially, what they did was randomize patients to get prednisone versus a placebo for about 3 months and then followed them out for about 5 years. And it turned out that patients who got prednisone were less likely to develop recurrent disease needing additional doses of prednisone down the road. And they were also more likely to improve their chest X-ray. Now, more recently, we've also done a study, and I'll keep coming back to this study, that shows that prednisone really works. And so this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine 2-3 months ago, so it's really hot off the press, where Dr. Kalman and her colleagues from Netherlands, put 2 groups of patients, one group of patients on prednisone, another group of patients on methotrexate, and looked at their lung function. And you can see from the blue line up there that patients who got prednisone actually improved their lung function, and they did it fairly quickly. So yes, prednisone works, but it comes at a price, guys. It comes at a price. It has a lot of side effects. It has a lot of toxicity. So this is a study from the Cleveland Clinic that looked at their patients over several years who they'd given prednisone and compared them to patients who didn't get prednisone. And what they found that patients who got pretty much almost any dose of prednisone were more likely to develop side effects. So they were about, 3.4 times more likely to develop high blood pressure, and they were about 2.8 times more likely to have an increase in their body mass, in their weight, or increased risk of obesity. And if you lump all of them together, any patient who got prednisone was about 30-something% more likely to develop any side effects or new comorbidities, including high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, all that. So steroids come at a price. More so, Remember how we talked about one of the effects of sarcoidosis being a reduction in quality of life? Guess what? Steroids also decrease quality of life. So this is, again, an older study, but extremely valid, that showed that patients who got not a lot of prednisone, just 500 milligrams of prednisone in the year before. So that's 5 milligrams of prednisone for just 3 months. That's it. They were more likely to feel tired, and they were more likely to report a reduced quality of life. So again, steroids work, but it comes at a price. So again, just, for us in this room, one of the take-home points for prednisone use is only use steroids if you need it. Make sure your starting doses are low. I have 20 milligrams there, but honestly, 5 to 10 milligrams is more than enough. And the goal at all times is to win the prednisone dose to the lowest possible dose and to come off prednisone as quickly as possible. And if you have providers who are not in this room, remind them that steroid taper can start as early as 2 to 3 weeks, because that's actually when you see the effect of the steroids. By 4 weeks, you've actually seen the peak effect of the prednisone. And actually, this study showed on the, I guess your left, my right, shows that the dose of prednisone actually did not correlate with improvement in lung function. All right, so we're going to move to second-line therapies. So the second-line treatments are methotrexate, azathioprine, leflunomide, and Cellcept. And pretty much they work on the T cell, so that's kind of like, remember, the second-line body defenders. That's where their maximum effect is on. Methotrexate is considered the first-line choice of second-line medicines. That's a lot of line in there. Essentially, it's the one that has the most data behind it. It is an anti-metabolite. It blocks folic acid in the body, so we always want to give patients folic acid when we give them methotrexate. It was originally designed as a cancer therapeutic agent, but in lower doses, we've actually shown that it works for patients with sarcoidosis. The one thing to know is it starts, onset of action is a little bit late, and you reach peak action usually by 4 to 6 months. This is a very small study, again, done several years ago, 2000, that showed us that methotrexate can be steroid sparing for patients with sarcoidosis, meaning patients who were given methotrexate along with prednisone in this very old and small, I must say, study, at the end of 6 months, patients who received both prednisone and methotrexate were more likely to win down their prednisone doses. Now, I mentioned this study. I think we have one more slide highlighting this study. But again, this hot off the press study from the Netherlands, I think it's going to change the way we treat sarcoidosis, showed that treating patients with methotrexate upfront was actually not inferior to treating them with prednisone upfront. So again, you remember this slide that I had showed before. Does this pointer work? No, it's okay. All right. So remember this slide that I had showed before. So essentially what they did was they randomized about 70 patients to get prednisone upfront and another 70, 68, 69 to get methotrexate upfront, and they followed them out. They found that patients who got prednisone immediately had an improvement in their lung function, but at the end of 6 months, patients who got methotrexate upfront had actually reached about the same lung function improvement. So in terms of lung function, methotrexate was not inferior to prednisone. They also looked at quality of life, which is the slide on this side. Do you guys see my pointer? No. Well, they also looked at quality of life and showed that patients who got both prednisone as well as patients who got methotrexate, when they compared them, they found that there was really no improvement, inferiority, in terms of quality of life. So both prednisone and methotrexate did the same. Methotrexate as an upfront treatment was not inferior to prednisone. Oh, and I just wanted to point out here, you see how the quality of life on prednisone starts to go down? So that's exactly what we see in patients who are treated with prednisone. All right, so I really wish I could say that methotrexate was the next thing, after sliced bread. It's not. It does have side effects. And in this study, again, from the Netherlands, it showed that 95% of patients in the study, whether they got prednisone or methotrexate, reported side effects. The side effect profile was different. Patients who got prednisone were more likely to have increased weight gain, increased appetite, whereas patients who got methotrexate were more likely to have fatigue, more likely to have nausea, and more likely to have abnormal liver tests. But again, at the end of the 6-month period, patients who received methotrexate were more likely to resolve their side effects, whereas patients who got prednisone had persistent side effects. Now, this is a study from Bofman's group that looked at over several years, 6 or 7 years of treating patients with methotrexate and found that overall methotrexate was safe. Most patients tolerated methotrexate well, and they really, in that cohort of a fairly large clinic of sarcoidosis patients, really didn't have a lot of significant or permanent side effect profile from methotrexate. All right, moving on. The second-line therapy that we will use commonly in patients with sarcoidosis is azathioprine, also known as Imiran. Again, it's an anti-inflammatory agent, blocks T cells. This study that compared patients who received azathioprine versus patients who got methotrexate found that in terms of steroid sparing, both of those medicines did about the same. However, patients who got azathioprine were a little more likely to discontinue their therapy. They were a little more likely to have side effects, especially infectious side effects. So again, that's a balancing act right there. The starting dose of azathioprine is 50 to about 150 milligrams a day. And we do need to monitor patients' liver numbers as well as their blood counts. But that's a treatment option that's available to us. The one thing I want to say here is that methotrexate is phytotoxic. So for patients, male and female of childbearing age, that needs to be a conversation, whereas azathioprine can be taken in pregnancy. So that may be one reason to take one medicine versus the other. Now, the other 2 or 3 medicines that we consider second-line therapies, leflunomide, mycophenolate, and plaquenil, we don't use those medicines as often as the first 2, and there's really no robust studies that have looked at those medicines. So sometimes we will use leflunomide to boost the effect of methotrexate. You do have to watch out for side effects like neuropathy. It's also not safe in pregnancy. CellCept has shown some efficacy in patients who have cardiac involvement, so sometimes we might use that for cardiac involvement. Hydroxychloroquine or Plaquenil is an anti-malaria medicine that is generally very mild, but has been found to be useful in patients who have skin sarcoid, who have high calcium, or in patients who have significant fatigue or tiredness. So what are some reasons for initiating or transitioning or adding to second-line therapy? The most common reason is what we call stepping up. So these are patients who have been on prednisone for 6 weeks to about 3 months, whose disease remains persistent, who are not able to wean their prednisone. We add this second-line agent for steroid sparing. I also talked about we can use methotrexate as first-line therapy, and increasingly, a lot of my patients are actually opting, again, patient preference, to start methotrexate upfront. I think that's going to become an overall increasing thing that we see in sarcoidosis. And then sometimes when patients have side effects to one second-line therapy, we'll switch them to another second-line therapy to see if they tolerate the medicine better. In general, though, if we have a patient whose disease continues to progress on second-line therapy with prednisone weaned to the lowest possible dose, we usually step them up to what we call the third-line therapy. Third-line therapies that we use commonly are biologic agents, infliximab and adalimumab. Those are the most common ones that we use. Infliximab, or what we call Remicade, is an IV medicine. So patients can, get that infusion in an infusion center, or sometimes they can also have those infusions at home. Typically, the starting dose is somewhere between 3 to 5 milligrams, and you're giving it, upfront 2 weeks apart, and then after that is every 4 to 6 weeks. Like everything, it does have side effects, but in general, it's well tolerated. We do worry about severe infections with infliximab, and in patients who have latent TB, they can have reactivation of their TB. So we always check for TB in patients before we start infliximab. This is the study that looked at infliximab, one of the earliest studies, randomized trial that looked at infliximab in patients with sarcoidosis. So essentially, they randomized about 100 patients, 138 patients here in the US as well as in Europe, and gave placebo versus infliximab. And at the end of 6 months, with follow-up to 52 weeks, patients who got infliximab had about 2.5%, I say that number and I cringe, improvement in their lung function. And when you kind of slice it down, you find that patients who had the most improvement were those who had more severe disease, whose lung function was already kind of low to begin with, and who had more symptom burden and who had worse quality of life. Unfortunately, because at the time we didn't know as much about sarcoidosis as we know now, the FDA did not approve that medicine because we hinged the entire decision on FVC. We now know better that FVC does not define sarcoidosis. A whole lot more defines sarcoidosis. And I hope that going forwards from here, we as a community can fix that problem. Since that study, infliximab has really become the cornerstone of treating patients who have sarcoidosis, severe sarcoidosis, whether it's sarcoidosis in the heart, whether it's sarcoidosis in the brain, whether it's sarcoidosis in the eyes, or whether it's severe disfiguring disease in the skin. Infliximab has been shown to be beneficial. Now, Humira or adalimumab is the second biologic agent that we use in sarcoidosis. Unlike infliximab, it's a shot that you give yourself. It's a subcutaneous shot, so technique matters. And the picture right here shows the best way to give Humira. Now, it is self-injected, so it may be more convenient for patients where you don't have to go to an infusion center or where you don't have to have an IV. There is not as much data in support of using Humira as there is for infliximab, and there is some suggestion that Humira may not be as effective as infliximab. I think it's important to note here that not all TNF-alphas, which both infliximab and Humira are TNF-alpha blockers. Remember how I told you all that TNF-alpha is the driving cytokine behind granuloma formation and granuloma persistence? Not all medicines that block TNF-alpha are created equal. The ones that are useful in patients with sarcoidosis are infliximab and adalimumab. One study that looked at etanercept, which is one of the oldest TNF agents available, found that patients with sarcoidosis didn't do well, and actually over years we've started to see that etanercept can actually cause sarcoidosis. Now, another study looked at golimumab, and it also wasn't effective. Now, TNF-alphas are extremely expensive. They are not approved by the FDA for treating sarcoidosis, so often we run into the problem where we can't get these medicines for our patients. And I actually lost a few patients, one painfully so, that we couldn't get infliximab for her neurosarcoidosis, and she ended up not doing well. All right, so I'm going to spend the last 5-7 minutes of the presentation talking about emerging therapies for sarcoidosis. All right, I'm going to bring this back here. Again, forgive me, it's really a very complex diagram. But there are 4 major treatments that I'll talk about. I'll talk about efzofitimod, I'll talk about XTMAB16, I'll talk about the JAK inhibitors. I really like that phrase, but it's a much longer name. And then I'll talk about mTOR inhibitors. And this is really where they all work in the cascade of forming granulomas. So efzofitimod is a neuropilin-2 inhibitor. That's a big fancy word. Those neuropilin-2 receptors are located on the surface of macrophages. Remember how I told you that those macrophages are the body's first line defense against infection? That's where those neuropilin-2 inhibitors are located. And this medicine, efzofitimod, blocks or modulates those inhibitors, and we think that that's how it helps in patients who have sarcoidosis, and that's its mechanism of action. And a phase 2 trial of patients with chronic pulmonary sarcoidosis was completed about 2-3 years ago, and it showed that patients who received efzofitimod versus placebo had improved lung function and improvement across board in all measures of quality of life. Again, it was a phase 2 study, and it was a very small study, about 39 patients. But when you lump patients who received the effective or therapeutic doses, so again, they looked at 3 doses, 1 milligrams, 3 milligrams, and 5 milligrams. Patients who got therapeutic doses were less likely to have recurrence of disease after they weaned their prednisone. That's important. So that medicine decreased prednisone doses, improved lung function, improved quality of life, and patients were able to maintain remission. A phase 3 trial looking at efzofitimod in over 120 patients with sarcoidosis across the world has just been completed, and we are eagerly awaiting the results of that study and praying and hoping that it's efficacious for our patients. XTMAB16 is another medicine that's being evaluated for patients with sarcoidosis. It blocks TNF-alpha. Remember how we looked at that original study that looked at infliximab and it was not approved? Well, XTMAB is another TNF-alpha blocker that is being studied in patients with sarcoidosis, and we're using better outcomes, wiser trial design, and we're hoping that this study will prove beneficial for our patients. We already know TNF blockers work. A phase 2 study looking at XTMAB16 in patients with sarcoidosis has recently been completed, and again, yay, we're waiting on results of that study. That's me, by the way. All right, JAK inhibitors. Okay, if you can say it for me, say Janus kinase inhibitors. Big fancy word, but I really like JAK inhibitors. So the Janus kinase enzymes play a role in regulating inflammation. So we found that this very nice study here, out of Yale, I think, Dempsey, yeah, looked at JAK inhibitors in patients with skin sarcoid, and particularly they looked at patients who had failed every single therapy, and they found that when they treated those patients with JAK inhibitors, those patients had resolution of their skin disease. And so again, suggests that it might be promising, and we've just I think finished almost, I think they've closed enrollment of a phase 2 study called Prepocitinib that's looking at JAK inhibitors in patients who have skin sarcoid. So again, we'll wait for results of that study. Now, mTOR inhibitors, this is even a bigger mouthful. mTOR stands for mammalian target of rapamycin. Big fancy word. But mTOR has been shown to potentially play a role in sarcoidosis patients. If you remember that diagram I showed you, mTOR pathway is suspected and actually shown in mouse models to upregulate that formation as well as persistence of granulomas, and may actually be involved in progression to fibrosis. So again, mTOR inhibitors are increasingly being studied in patients with sarcoidosis, and a group from Vienna was actually able to develop a mouse model where they showed that when they upregulated the mTOR in the mice, they developed spontaneous granulomas, and those granulomas became chronic and bigger as long as mTOR pathway was activated. And so this study, again from Vienna, just again, phase 1 study, very, very early trial, 16 patients, looked at patients with skin sarcoid and were treated with mTOR, and it looked like those patients did well. Now, there's a lot of case reports and case series about mTOR use in patients with sarcoidosis, but again, I'm focusing on just clinical trials because we want to focus on high-quality studies. All right, so putting it all together. So, the treatment of sarcoidosis is a whole lot more than steroids. If you take anything away from this presentation, please just take this slide away. It is more than steroids, period. Not every patient with sarcoidosis needs therapy. Every patient needs to be managed because there are some manifestations of sarcoidosis that have absolutely nothing to do with active granuloma formation, and we need to identify those manifestations and support our patients through that. But even when they do need treatment, there's a whole lot more than steroids. So that's one takeaway point. Takeaway point number 2. When medicines are needed, a stepwise approach using guided therapy based on science is available and can be adopted. Emerging therapies are upcoming in sarcoidosis. The future is bright, and I want to thank you all for the privilege and honor of being here. And thank you, Michelle, because right by my hotel, I actually saw the cyclists coming and I was able to get pictures. I took 2 pictures. The one on the right is a little blurred, and I got a second picture that is much sharper, and I said to myself, this is sarcoidosis. Things are becoming more focused and sharper for everyone. Thank you.
Dr. Obi, all right, thank you, Dr. Obi. Up next, we have a brief break. Separate from we've been getting knowledge overload, a lot of information, and so we wanted to kind of recenter ourselves and do a quick 10-minute guided meditation. So I have with us here Mr. Peter Van Buren, who is gonna, it's a short period, but he's gonna walk us through some guided meditation.
So, hi everybody. My name's Peter Van Buren, and I'm teaching, I teach a practice. I'm very low tech, you see? So, yeah. You've been hearing a lot of high-tech stuff going on, and we're low-tech here. And that actually suits what I'm going to be trying to do with you all, is to disconnect. We disconnect from all the things that are preying on our minds and all this info that we're going in, and just give our brains a little rest. It's like unplugging the cell phone and charging it up again. And this is something I encourage you to do on a regular basis. That's what meditation is about, by the way. Don't let all the things you've heard confuse you. It's a very simple skill that anybody should learn to do because it's really good for human beings. So what I'd like you to do, and I was just testing out these seats, they're not the easiest. I really like in general to sit in a chair like I am right now so that you can sit up straight and with your feet on the floor. But these chairs are not made to do that in, folks. So what I found was the best for me, and you try it yourself, was to get your Batutsky back in the chair as much as possible, and then to try to sit up as straight as possible and to try to make your neck be comfortable as possible. And so that's what I was finding. Your feet flat on the floor. Feet flat on the floor is really nice, and sort of spread out so that they're comfortable. And then forget all I said, and if you feel that you can be more comfortable some other way, do it. But that's the best thing, is to get into a place where you're nice, where you can relax everything. And so that's what I'm going to work on now with you, is relaxing everything. Because the practice that I teach is about moving one's chi, moving one's life force, making it flow better. The flow is in all of us. You know it is because you're alive. When the flow stops of chi, when the flow of chi stops, you're dead. Since all of you are not dead yet, I know your chi is flowing through you just fine. Now, that works perfectly. You don't even have to know about it. It's what life is all about. But this practice and other practices like it help the life force to flow better, fuller, richer, cleaner, more nourishing, more wisdom. So why wouldn't you want to do it? And the way to let the chi flow better first is to relax. So I want you to sit in that comfortable position. Feel free to close your eyes or leave them open if that's more comfortable. Or go back and forth, either way. But then take a big breath in. Let it out and relax. Ah. And do it again. Big breath, big breath. Ah. And now, take your shoulders and lift them up and drop down. Do it again. Up, down. Last time. Up, down. And then just let them stay down, nice and relaxed. And then, starting at the top, relax your face. Look for the tension and let it go. Let it just melt away. All the tight muscles. The wrinkles in your forehead. The corners of your eyes. Your ears. Relax your ears. Relax all the muscles around your nose and mouth. Everything soft, like a baby's face. And then the relaxation flow down your neck and into your shoulders and chest. All the muscles can relax. Feel the space between your cells getting bigger. Relax your arms, your elbows and wrists. Let go of any tension. Relax your fingers and hands. Become soft and light. And go inside your body and relax your insides. All the organs. Everything can take a vacation. Especially down in the belly. Relax your legs. Feel your knees bent, your feet planted on the floor. Feel the connection with earth. The earth is so powerful, holding us all up, building the chairs, all of us, all the time. Feel our connection to that power. And then relax your mind. Let go of the worries. Just be happy. Just be. We spend so much time thinking about the past and thinking about the future, worrying about it all, obsessing. Let it go at times and just be. We're human beings, and we've forgotten how to just be. And then think of something really, really happy. Something that makes you smile and grin from ear to ear. Something that lights you up. When you light up, you glow. When you smile, you glow, a real smile. And the world glows back. So nice to pass on. Take a big breath and let it out. And come on back into the room. Blink your eyes a few times. I hope I didn't put you too far asleep. Wherever you went, especially, well, if you didn't enjoy it, don't go there again. But if you did enjoy it, I want you to know that you did it. I didn't do it, I talked. But think of what I said. It was so simple. I told you to relax the parts of your body and to smile and be happy and enjoy just being here, being you, wherever you are. That's it. That's the trick. Practice that, and you're really practicing something good. Give yourself a chance every now and then. Hey, have a great rest of the conference.
So up next, we have Dr. Alba Zola, who is a rehabilitation physician here at Johns Hopkins, who cares for people living with conditions like long COVID, chronic fatigue syndrome, POTS, and sarcoidosis. She co-founded the post-acute COVID-19 clinic here at Johns Hopkins to help patients manage the long-term effects of COVID-19 and works closely with patients to improve function and quality of life. Dr. Zola is passionate about listening to patients' experiences, finding practical strategies to manage symptoms such as fatigue, and helping people feel supported on their health journey. So thank you, Dr. Zola, for joining us today.
Thank you. Hi, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, Michelle, and entrusting me with sharing about what I do for patients that are struggling with fatigue. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about the relationship between sarcoidosis and fatigue, and how we can apply things that we have learned for other conditions and how to manage fatigue into this patient population. Fatigue is super common in sarcoidosis. Everybody knows this. And it depends on the study, but anywhere from 40 to 80% of patients report having significant fatigue that's impairing, that's limiting their ability to live their lives and the quality of life. And it tends to actually persist. Even if the disease is well managed and controlled, the patients can continue to experience this debilitating fatigue. And the association between chronic fatigue syndrome and sarcoidosis has been described in the literature since the 1990s. So this is a very close relationship. And the more I learn about it, the more it makes sense to apply the principles that we use for chronic fatigue in patients with sarcoid and fatigue. You'll see throughout the presentation how they even have common comorbid conditions and common kind of phenotypes, or like what the patient's, the qualities of the patient. So fatigue is unpredictable, it's overwhelming. You know, typically I describe it as a roller coaster, because you have really good days where you feel ready to go, and then that sometimes can be followed by crashes where you feel miserable and it takes days to get out and feel energized enough to go at it again. Just things like showering, dressing, cooking, the basics. Also, fatigue is one of those things that patients often don't discuss with clinicians, or we actually sometimes don't create a space where patients feel comfortable enough to talk about it and to describe what their body's experiencing. And often is dismissed, and this is historically true for any conditions that are primarily manifesting as fatigue. When somebody says, I'm fatigued, often you hear, well, I'm also tired, or, and sometimes undermining, right, the importance that symptom is to the patient. And often they feel shy about talking about it or expressing that something can be done for it. In sarcoid specifically, there are many factors that are contributing to fatigue. You have things like the disease itself, just like we were talking about just before. There's this severe inflammation, and medications can actually help with decreasing that and improve some of the fatigue. But often some of the medications themselves can cause fatigue, as we were talking earlier, so it can be a little bit complicated. Other medical problems, of course, common things are common, and we know that there are several common causes of fatigue that we know how to treat, like thyroid issues and other autoimmune issues like Hashimoto's thyroiditis can be common in these populations, so we want to make sure we identify those and treat them. Also, anemia can be common, so we want to identify those. Other vitamin deficiencies like B12 or vitamin D deficiency, which is a little bit complex in sarcoid, but B12 in particular is something that we can address. The other common cause of fatigue is sleep issues, anything from disordered sleep to insomnia. And actually, in the chronic fatigue literature, we know that people that suffer with chronic fatigue syndrome have disturbed sleep. They don't have the same sleep architecture that allows you to have restful sleep. And often in these patients, sleep is never restful. It's actually one of the defining diagnostic criteria for chronic fatigue, is that feeling of unrefreshing rest or sleep. And a common presentation in sarcoid is small fiber neuropathy. This small fiber neuropathy can also contribute to fatigue, not only because of the pain that can sometimes present with it, but also because small fibers are responsible for sending the messages of the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is the system that takes care of automatic things. So things like being able to shift positions from laying down to standing, and blood pressure and heart rate, making the changes so that you don't feel dizzy, lightheaded, or what we say presyncopal. Other things is the digestive system, basically the urinary system. Every system in your body is regulated unconsciously by this part of the nervous system, and this can also contribute greatly to fatigue. So, what are the treatment strategies? And I'm just going to focus in general. The literature review that I did for kind of the understanding of treatment in sarcoid at the time is identifying kind of causes. So we want to correct all of those treatable causes. We also want to address mood issues, because we know that mood can contribute to fatigue, and some of those symptoms can be confused. But I have a little bit of a pet peeve with this particular issue. And I just want to explain, when somebody has a chronic condition that it's not allowing them to live their lives as their neighbors, as their family members and friends, you're not going to feel very happy about that. And that will contribute to feeling depressed. So the depression often is thought as kind of the source of the fatigue, but I think the fatigue itself and the limitations to their day-to-day activities, it's what's driving some of the depressed mood. So I just want to clarify that it's not that just depression causes the fatigue. And often we see this, for example, as a physical medicine and rehab doctor. We see patients that have strokes or acute traumatic brain injuries or after an accident or traumatic spinal cord injuries. And this type of events, we see how they acutely change the way people live lives, and they inevitably lead to mood and coping issues, right? So for me, in my mind, any chronic illness is similar to this type of condition where you're losing your abilities and impaired the way that you do basic day-to-day activities. So that of itself is depressing. And we need to acknowledge that. Also, we don't want to manage sleep disorders. And I'm not going to go too much into this, but sleep disorders, there's some kind of easy day-to-day kind of lifestyle changes that can be implemented. I'm happy to talk about it if anybody wants more details on that, but things like avoiding the screens at night and using certain settings on your phone to decrease the light on your phone when you're using it at night, sleep hygiene. So there are several things that we can do to improve that. And sometimes we can also target the fatigue directly. So there are studies reporting the use of stimulants for management of fatigue in this patient population specifically. They're small, but they do offer some evidence for us to use those, and they can be used. For example, Ritalin, which is known for its treatment of attention deficit disorder, has been helpful for patients with fatigue and cognitive brain fog. And the brain fog it's that feeling of clouding, difficulty processing, forgetting words, losing your train of thought, all of a sudden having to go back 20 times to do a recipe that you know could easily make, but you're forgetting each step and you have to go back to that book. And I see the faces nodding because it's a very common description in my patients that have sarcoid. And modafinil I also use, which is a stimulant that's mostly used for wakefulness. So people that have obstructive sleep apnea and things of the sort can use this to decrease the amount of daytime sleepiness. Exercise programs and cognitive behavioral therapy have been described as helpful in patients with sarcoid, but I will explain in a bit why it's important to be careful when to engage in, or which patients, or if an exercise program is right for you. Because not everybody will tolerate an exercise program that maybe a different patient may tolerate. So it's important that we think about carefully when is adequate to engage in an exercise program. Fatigue is real, and that's what I'm here to tell every single person here, and it's something that can be more debilitating than other symptoms from sarcoid. So it's very important that that's acknowledged. It's not just being depressed or being sad. Fatigue is real. And like I said, even if your lungs look great, that can still be there and can be debilitating. And talk openly to your healthcare provider about, your experience and what are ways that the provider can provide assistance, right, and treatments that can help you improve from that. And typically, just like treating sarcoid disease, treating fatigue is a step-by-step approach. It's very individualized, and this is an important consideration when we are making recommendations for the treatment of fatigue. And this is the main takeaway for my talk, if you leave with anything from it, is that all fatigue is not created equal. All fatigue is not created equal. And there may be some people here that are experiencing this type of fatigue, maybe not. There's not a lot of information on exactly how many patients have chronic fatigue syndrome. Their thought is about 40% in some of the reports. And the difference between the fatigue that maybe I experience and the fatigue that patients with chronic fatigue experience is a symptom called post-exertional malaise. And this sounds like an 1800 novel symptom, post-exertional malaise, and you're passing out, but the name is not very descriptive. But this is kind of a word cloud of qualitative study that was done by the NIH on chronic fatigue syndrome and what the patients actually experience. Post-exertional malaise is a physiologic response. Typically occurs about hours to days after the inciting activity. It will present as an exacerbation of symptoms, not only with severe exhaustion, but also body pain, headaches, feeling like you're getting ill. You might even think you have a virus. You get sore throat. Some people get fevers. You can have tremors. You can have worsening of the brain fog, worsening of your ability to be upright, and feeling dizzy, having to spend more time laying down. So all of these symptoms all coming at once, and usually they take several days to improve and significant amount of rest. And they're triggered, most importantly, by things that are usually well tolerated by the general population. So this could come from going to the supermarket for shopping. In some people, it can come from doing their laundry or doing some household chores. So it's really important to understand that this type of fatigue with the post-exertional malaise needs to be treated with caution because activity is what precipitates these symptoms. And what we see is what I like to call the corona coaster, because I learned about this type of fatigue with long COVID patients, but we can say Sarco coaster if you want. But it's this push-crash cycle. So you feel good one day, you try to do as much as possible, and then inevitably a day or two after, you are crashed. Or you plan for that birthday party or this baby shower. And after that is done, the next day you can't get out of bed, you have worsening of your pain, all of those things. So like I was saying, this is part of the diagnostic criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome. So what is chronic fatigue syndrome? And the National Academy of Medicine defines it as substantial impairment in activities that may be well tolerated before the illness that lasts greater than 6 months. The presence of post-exertional malaise and the presence of unrefreshing sleep. And you don't need to have both, but many people have both of the other criteria. You can have one of them and meet criteria. It's cognitive impairments, which many people describe as brain fog, or orthostatic intolerance, which means that there are symptoms that come when you're upright, either seated for a prolonged period of time or standing, and are improved by laying down. So that's what orthostatic intolerance means. So how do we manage this? In these patients, sometimes starting physical activity or exercise may not be the best choice. It doesn't mean that we don't want them to do that. It just means that we need to make sure that that is safe for them to do. Because if somebody presents with post-exertional malaise after doing their laundry or putting away the clothes, then we know that we need to get you to a better place before we start an activity protocol, okay? And what we really want to focus on is energy conservation, pacing. For example, breaking activities into smaller pieces. If you're going to be cooking, you're going to sit down to prep and you're going to put that away, come back and do the second part of the meal, not try to get through it the whole at once. So really breaking down tasks in smaller pieces and scheduling rest time in between can allow you to achieve more rather than pushing through and trying to get through it. Prioritizing which activities are the ones that are important to you that you want to invest your energy on. So in some people, they may be able to have their family members help with the household chores so that they can spend time with them and socialize and do more, be able to invest in things like that. It's very individualized, but what I'm trying to say is you have the choice on where you want to invest your energy, and it's important when you make those choices. The planning and positioning, prioritizing, all of these are principles that we use in energy conservation and will help you manage the limited energy that you have so that you can achieve the things that you really want to do. And that's not what I decide. Somebody may choose to invest all of their energy at work because their family depends on it and they need the insurance, and it's the patient's choice, right? How they want to spend their energy, but it's important to implement those principles. Some people need a lot of help in implementing this, mainly because a lot of our society and our mentality is to push, get things done, achieve. That is what makes you a better person. But we have to kind of rewire our brain and learn, what is our ability, how much activity can we do. So we want to keep an activity diary. One of the other reasons why we want to keep an activity diary may be because there's a delay on the post-exertional malaise symptoms. So you may be experiencing a crash, but it wasn't necessarily what happened the day before. It could have been 2 or 3 days before. So it's important to be able to write it down because the brain fog is real, and you need to trace back and see what activities or how many high intensity activities were too much for you. There are apps that work for, that were designed specifically for people with chronic fatigue that actually utilize wearable devices like your Apple Watch or a band or a Fitbit, and they look at your heart rate variations, your heart rate variability, which is another biofeedback tool, and they will help you decide how much is your energy envelope that you can handle. And it's actually kind of nice because it'll send you an alert when you're doing too much and remind you that you're reaching your maximum. That way we want to prevent episodes of post-exertional malaise by preventing exceeding that. As providers, we can actually help you implement these techniques of energy conservation. We can provide dural medical equipment. For example, using a shower chair can decrease energy by 25%. And that's energy that you can use playing with your grandchildren instead of showering. And I tell a lot of my patients, you don't have to shower every day. You have permission to really, again, invest the energy where you need it. Especially if you're coming to my visit, you don't have to. But yeah, reasonable accommodations at work, closer parking placards, things like that can help decrease the amount of energy that you're leaking and help you use energy for the things that you want. And also psychology, the role of neuropsychology and cognitive behavioral therapy cannot be understated. I mean, living with a chronic illness is very difficult. And it requires that we have coping skills that we're just not born with. So learning coping skills from a professional can allow you to navigate the world with your chronic illness. And it can also help you decrease the amount of emotional energy that sometimes is investing when you're having difficulty with coming to terms with your chronic illness. I don't know if you get it, but I think you do. And one thing that I haven't pointed out yet, but it's extremely important, is that your energy envelope is not only described by your physical activity, it's also going to be your emotional activity, your cognitive activity. All of those things are working on the same battery. So imagine you are an iPhone 5 instead of an iPhone, whatever they are on now, 16. And you can't run all those apps at the same time, right? Some days you're going to be an iPhone 5, and some days you may be a 10, but you have to learn to navigate those variations in your total energy envelope as you go through your days. This is a very confusing slide and very busy, but it's how our group kind of looks at chronic fatigue syndrome and the different comorbid conditions that can affect the amount of energy that you have. And I actually found that as I kind of been reading about the literature and getting more familiar with sarcoidosis, that the presence of fibromyalgia, the presence of hypermobility or hypermobile EDS is actually high in this population. So it's something that they have in common with the chronic fatigue syndrome population. So I think there's a lot of crossover between the two. Also, a high presence of allergies and intolerances of foods are also seen in the population. So I am running out of time, but I want to just run through one of the most common contributors to the fatigue, which is orthostatic intolerance. And this is something that comes from the small fiber neuropathy and the potential effect that has on your body's ability to change blood pressure and heart rate and perfusion to the brain when you're going from laying down to standing. So in our clinic, we kind of have you lay down for 5 minutes, stand up, check your changes in heart rate and blood pressure. In this case, there's not a huge difference between the heart rate when they were laying down and they were standing, but there is a persistent elevated heart rate, which is not a normal response. This is actually loosely based on a sarcoid patient that I saw. They can have autonomic dysfunction. In this case, this patient has inappropriate sinus tachycardia. So this persistent elevated heart rate is something that we can see in this population. Some other patients can have drops in blood pressure when they're upright, for example, but all of these are part of the autonomic dysfunction. Another thing that we can commonly see while they're doing this is the changes in color of their lower extremities. So they can be, when laying down, very pale, but when at the end of the 10 minutes of standing, you can see a significant change in color of their extremities. And this can indicate acrocyanosis or blood pooling. And just, I tell my patients to think about how that blood it's now not available to circulate in the rest of their body, specifically their brain, and that's why sometimes when you're upright waiting in line at Costco, you can get lightheaded, headaches, feel uncomfortable, and wanting to sit down. In people with more melanin, sometimes it's hard to see the change in the legs when they're standing, but I look at the soles of their feet. This is an example where you can see at the beginning of the stand test and at the end of the stand test, there's a change in the color so that you can actually visualize this. And they also have a change in their capillary refill. In this patient, it takes about 6 seconds for the blood flow to get back to that area, but it should take about 3 or less. And just, I'll make this important point because we have studies in the cohort of patients with chronic fatigue syndrome that show that even in those patients that don't have brisk jumps in heart rate or drops in blood pressure or elevated heart rate all the time. People with normal heart rate and blood pressure, they have decreased cerebral blood flow. So in this graph, it's looking at the blood flow to the brain in a healthy person, usually when going from laying down to standing. So in a normal person in blue, there's a decrease, about 2%. In a person with, in this case, these were COVID chronic fatigue patients with autonomic dysfunction, the drop was much larger, about 33%. And in people with normal heart rate and blood pressure, which are the red ones, those people still have a significant decrease in blood flow to the brain, even if they don't have a drop in blood pressure or a jump in heart rate or a normal heart rate pattern. The hypermobility we usually screen for with the Baton score. The literature does report some co-occurrence of sarcoid and hypermobility. And this can actually be also associated with a lot of joint pains and muscle aches. So they also require special or specialized physical therapy to address the hypermobility and the instability of some of the joints. And that can be really helpful in this patient population with hypermobility. And also exaggerated allergic reactions in some patients or food intolerances can be seen. These patients require management of those allergy symptoms, and treating that actually also helps decrease the amount of fatigue that the patient experiences, because the reason why they're having these allergies is because some of the cells that respond to allergic reactions are actually releasing a lot of mediators that can cause fatigue and inflammation. So what can you do if you feel like maybe some of this applies to you? I think it's really important to hydrate. And I know this sounds kind of duh, of course, we need to hydrate. But I mean, it would surprise you if you really take account on how much you're drinking. We really want people to be drinking about 100 ounces. So people that are experiencing this difficulty with upright posture can benefit from 2 to 3 liters. That could be like 80 to 100 ounces of water. In some patients, sodium can be helpful because it allows for more of that water to stay in the body. However, some people have high blood pressure, so that doesn't apply to people that have high blood pressure. So I just want to put that out there. It's not for everybody, very personalized. And compression can be really helpful because, as you saw, some of that blood pools in the legs. So using compression socks, the higher the compression, the better. If you get compression leggings with abdominal compression as well, all of that can be really helpful in increasing the amount of time that you can be upright without getting symptoms. And there are some things that you can do, and you probably notice that if you have something that feels familiar, you're already doing this. We see our patients usually crossing their legs or bringing them under themselves, or wearing heels can feel good, or instead of standing in line in one position, you're fidgeting and moving, and those are like responses that the body does to try to compensate for what the body's experiencing. It helps use the muscle as a pump and return some of that blood up. And also identify your triggers. What are the things that are triggering the fatigue? A lot of patients have sensitivities to or difficulty managing their temperature. This is also part of the autonomic dysfunction. So using things like cooling garments or cooling vest can be really helpful in terms of navigating hot environments. Think of yourself as a lizard. You can't regulate your own body temperature, so you have to use the sun, or you have to use external things to help you regulate your body temperature. Again, educated patient is an empowered patient. I hope that you guys learned something about pacing and identifying triggers and managing those fatigue symptoms, especially if in your case you feel that the fatigue is causing you to have these crashes or this exaggerated symptom exacerbations. And set realistic and incremental goals. This requires a lot of fine-tuning for you to understand and start listening to your body and when you can do activity and when you can't push through. It's not one size fits all, that's for sure. I wanted to show you some resources. This is a book written by the leader in our clinic, Dr. Peter Rowe, on managing orthostatic intolerance. This is meant for patients to kind of learn and empower themselves with the knowledge needed to learn to manage their fatigue. And again, I wanted to mention the Visible. I don't get a penny out of it, but it's a really good app that can be really helpful in measuring and giving you some biofeedback from wearables on how much energy you can invest and when to step back and rest. And I just wanted to thank again for the opportunity of being here, and I wanted to open up for some questions.
Thank you so much, Kayla, for that introduction. This is one of my favorite events to go to. I came here last year, and I was very excited to come again this year. Again, my name is Nancy Lynn. I'm at Johns Hopkins. Like Kayla said, I'm a pulmonologist here at the Johns Hopkins Sarcoidosis Center. But prior to coming here, I was in Denver at National Jewish, where about 50% of the time I was seeing occupational pulmonary patients. So occupational exposures is something that's very close to my heart. And so today I'm really going to be talking about occupational exposures and sarcoidosis. So in this talk, I'll be talking about why we think sarcoidosis is caused by exposures. And I know we touched, a lot of the previous speakers touched on this topic already. And then I'm going to go into some specific exposures associated with sarcoidosis, including agricultural exposures, the World Trade Center dust, military exposures, infection, and silica. So I'm just going to talk about why we think exposures and sarcoidosis go together. So this is probably the most common question I get in my clinic is what causes sarcoidosis? And I think this is also the most important question. But like people before me have said, there's really not, we don't have the exact answer. But there are many theories out there. And then again, the truth of the matter is that it's likely a combination of both the environment and genetics. So there are several environmental factors that could be associated with sarcoidosis, things as, I guess, innocent as even weather and geography. So here's a graph of different cities in different countries and what season sarcoidosis is most likely diagnosed. And it seems from the research that springtime is most often the season that sarcoidosis gets diagnosed. And there's really not, as far as I know, a known reason for that. But other environmental exposures include, potential wood stove exposures, living on a farm. So there's really a lot of different exposures out there, enough to do a whole separate presentation and probably a whole separate conference. But today I'm really going to focus again on the occupational exposures. Why are occupational exposures important in sarcoidosis? So in general, sarcoidosis is a disease of the working age individual. It rarely occurs in children. Occasionally we will get cases in our pediatric populations, but that really is just a handful. We think it's a disease of adults who work. Exposures in the workplace are unique in that they are often more specific and more concentrated than the exposures that you might get in your home environment or kind of out when you're running errands, that kind of thing. So this has already been discussed before me, but I'm just going to kind of review the mechanistic aspects of what causes sarcoidosis from the immune perspective. So again, we think sarcoidosis is caused by dysregulated immune response. And this dysregulated immune response is really acting like it's seeing some kind of foreign pathogen, also called an antigen. So this is a normal process that the immune system undergoes when it sees something that's foreign. And so normally what happens is you get these specialized immune cells called T cells. They proliferate and then ultimately lead to the formation of granulomas. And again, all of this was discussed before my presentation. So in sarcoidosis, we don't know what the pathogen is, but we see the consequences of something like a pathogen activating the immune response. So we see this proliferation of specialized T cells, and then of course the formation of granulomas. So other exposures cause other kinds of granulomatous diseases. So I think beryllium disease was mentioned before. So beryllium exposure causes a disease that's almost exactly like pulmonary sarcoidosis. The big difference is that it's caused by exposure to beryllium. Infections like tuberculosis, leprosy, fungal infections, those are all infections that also cause granulomas. And then I think Dr. Bonham mentioned hypersensitivity pneumonitis. So that's a lung disease that can occur when you're exposed to things like bird feathers and mold, and you also get granulomas in that disease. So by analogy, it makes sense that sarcoidosis, being a granulomatous disease, is also associated and potentially caused by exposures, or I would say most likely caused by some sort of environmental exposure. So a study from 2019 estimated that about 30% of sarcoidosis cases could be explained by occupational exposures. Said in another way, the occupational burden of sarcoidosis is estimated to be about 30%. And if you look at that graph there, this was the most of any other of the respiratory diseases they looked at, including respiratory diseases like asthma, COPD, pneumonias, tuberculosis. So sarcoidosis was at 30%. And they figured that out by kind of pooling all the available literature out there about the specific pulmonary diseases and exposures. So that's just to say there's a lot of literature about exposures in sarcoidosis. So what is occupational lung disease? You probably can already surmise this from what I've already talked about. But so it's the study of respiratory disease caused by occupational exposures. Like I said, the exposures in the workplace are more concentrated. Also, in general, the working adult will spend a significant amount of time at work exposed to these exposures. We think about 1 in 10 of all lung diseases are a consequence of occupational exposures or have some sort of occupational exposure component. So it's important to identify exposures that cause lung disease, because part of the treatment will be removing that person from the exposure. If that's not possible, as is the case in many occupational exposures, you can do things to try to mitigate exposures, and that's PPE, like masks and that sort of thing, or air cleaners. Also, another important aspect of occupational lung disease is workers' compensation. So for those of you who don't know, workers' compensation is an insurance that provides benefits to workers that become injured on the job, or they develop an illness from an exposure. And this workers' compensation can pay for medical care related to the condition and can also provide cash payment for lost wages due to missing work because of the disability. But I have to say a caveat here that our knowledge about exposures and sarcoidosis is not complete. We're still doing a lot of active research in this area because we simply don't know that one exposure that causes sarcoidosis. As such, workers' compensation usually does not accept sarcoidosis as a claim for workers' compensation, essentially. The one exception of that is the military, which I will talk more about in future slides. So just to summarize that section that I just went over, so sarcoidosis is likely caused by some unknown environmental pathogen. Occupational exposures are important for the adults because they're specific and concentrated. And we think that sarcoidosis has a high likelihood of being caused by occupational exposures. And it's really important to identify an occupational exposure component to one's disease for treatment purposes and then also workers' compensation. But I do want to emphasize again, unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of workers' compensation cases approved in sarcoidosis. So now I'm going to talk about some of the large epidemiological studies done in sarcoidosis and exposures. I'm going to talk about 4 of these large epidemiological studies. The first one being the Newman and Barnard cohort. And this study looked at about 700 sarcoidosis cases controlled to compared to 700 controls. And this study found that exposures to things like musty odors at work, exposures to insecticides and agricultural work seemed to increase the risk for developing sarcoidosis. They also found that teachers had a higher incidence of sarcoidosis as well. This next study, the Liu et al. Study, this was a death certificate study done in they looked at about over 3,000 death certificates and so what that means is just on the death certificate, sarcoidosis was listed as a cause of the mortality in that particular person. And they found an elevated sarcoidosis mortality in people who work with metals, people who are in healthcare, again, teachers, and people who work in sales, banking, and administration. The Dubelby study was a Swiss study. They looked at, again, almost 3,000 persons. And theirs was more kind of geography-based, and they found that the prevalence of sarcoidosis tended to be higher in regions with intense metal and agricultural industries. And the GRAD study is the most recent large epidemiological study that we have on sarcoidosis and exposures. This was just published in 2022. And this one looked specifically at about 9 occupational and 9 environmental exposures. And unfortunately, this study did not find any significant associations between exposures and the diagnosis of sarcoidosis. But this might have had something to do with the sample size. As you can see, the sample size was a little lower than some of these other previous studies. So the results from these large studies haven't really given us anything definitive, and sometimes the results were conflicting. So for example, in one study, they showed that metalworking had a lower association with the diagnosis of sarcoidosis, and then in some of the other studies, working with metals increased the association with sarcoidosis. So there's a few exposures like that that have somewhat ambiguous results. But I will say that these large studies have given us a lot of signals of different exposures that sarcoidosis may be associated with. And this includes agricultural work and work with metals, jobs involving working closely with others. So that includes people like teachers, healthcare workers, people in administration. And then I think this also emphasizes the theory that sarcoidosis, in terms of the environmental exposure, is probably caused by many different environmental exposures, not just one. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to some more specific exposures, and I'll begin with the World Trade Center dust association. So there's a phenomenon called the World Trade Center associated sarcoidosis phenomenon. So basically, after 9/11 and after the first responders were there cleaning up after the World Trade Center collapse, they found several years later that there seemed to be an increased diagnosis of sarcoidosis among the first responders. And then Isbicki et al., they did a study and found that the incidence of sarcoidosis in fact did increase in Fire Department of New York workers, and the incidence increased from 15 out of 100,000 to 22 out of 100,000. And that might not seem like a lot, but that actually was quite a significant increase in the diagnosis of sarcoidosis. And I think, as some people had mentioned before, firefighters in general do seem to already at baseline have a higher incidence of sarcoidosis. And so after 9/11, these workers had an even higher frequency of being diagnosed. Several studies after this one supported the findings. And what was also really interesting is that the responders who arrived the earliest to the World Trade Center collapse, those that worked on the debris pile itself as opposed to, somewhere off the debris pile, those individuals were more likely to be diagnosed with sarcoidosis. So there seemed to be some kind of dose response to the World Trade Center dust exposure as well. And so all of this is just highly compelling evidence that there is an association between World Trade Center dust exposure and then the development of sarcoidosis. So what was it in the World Trade Center dust that contributed to the development of sarcoidosis? So unfortunately, it's really hard to tell. So the World Trade Center dust contained over 400 compounds, as you can imagine. These were large buildings in New York. There was also the components of the plane. There was a lot of fire. And so, some of these compounds contain concrete, glass, asbestos, metals, smokes, fuels, plastics. There was a lot of stuff. So it's really unknown what specific component of the World Trade Center dust contributed the most to sarcoidosis. There is something called the World Trade Center Health Program, which is a federal program that was enacted in 2010. The formal name is the James Zadroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act. So this program does provide benefits for first responders and survivors of the World Trade Center collapse. And it provides no-cost treatment for any certified World Trade Center health condition in different centers of excellence across the country. A lot of them are centered in New York. As you can imagine, a lot of our survivors and first responders are from that area. And sarcoidosis is one of those certified World Trade Center related health conditions. So in summary of the World Trade Center dust exposure, it's one of the most compelling exposures associated with sarcoidosis. However, it's really difficult to tell exactly what in the dust contributed the most to sarcoidosis. And there is federal compensation for both responders and survivors of those individuals who were exposed to a significant amount of World Trade Center dust. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to sarcoidosis in the military and how military exposures may contribute to the development of sarcoidosis. So this comes as no surprise, I'm sure, but military personnel are exposed to many different exposures. I mean, some of these include Agent Orange, dust, fuels, and then some exposures that we probably will never know about. And they may have impact on health. We do know that veterans in general have a shorter life expectancy than the general population, and this potentially could be due to some of the exposures they had while in the military. So I was just discussing the study with somebody. So there was a recent study that looked at veteran health electronic records between 2003 and 2019, and it showed that the incidence of sarcoidosis was 5 times higher and 3 times more prevalent in military personnel compared to civilians. If you're Black, female, living in the Northeast, if you smoke, And if you served in the Army, Air Force, or multiple service branches as opposed to the Navy, you were more likely to have to be diagnosed with sarcoidosis. This same group also looked at mortality in veterans in the records and found that veterans had with sarcoidosis had a higher all-cause mortality, so mortality from every cause, not just sarcoidosis, by about 4.7%. And again, there were some factors associated with an increased mortality that included older age, being male, black race, living in the Northeast, and serving in the Army or Air Force. And I will say in this study, I think Maryland was considered a northeastern state. I found this to be an interesting study as well. So this study looked at lung biopsies in 391 military personnel, and 137 of these lung biopsies were in individuals who had been deployed to Southwest Asia, and that includes countries like Afghanistan and Iraq. And so they found that the individuals who were deployed to Southwest Asia, they were more likely to have non-necrotizing granulomas on their lung biopsies compared to people who were not deployed to that region. And so in the right context, those individuals very well could have had sarcoidosis. So what specific activities in the military were most associated with a diagnosis of sarcoidosis? There was a study that looked at that, looking among veterans in the Airborne Hazards and Open Burn Pit Registry. And they really found that it was convoy activities that was most associated with sarcoidosis, and that was more so than things like burn pit exposure, pesticide exposure, dust storm exposure. And really, further research needs to be done as to exactly why convoy activities may be more, contribute more to the development of sarcoidosis. Like a lot of things in sarcoidosis, we don't really know why being in the military increases your risk of developing sarcoidosis. But one possible culprit is beryllium exposure. So beryllium is a lightweight conductive metal that is often used in the military. It's used a lot in the Air Force, building the fighter jets. They have a lot of beryllium parts because it's so lightweight. Also, weapons, again, which are things that go in the air, they need lightweight metals. And so nuclear bombs, targeting systems also contain a lot of beryllium. Berylliosis is the lung disease that develops from exposure to beryllium. And like I said before, it causes a disease that's just like pulmonary sarcoidosis. And you can diagnose it by having a positive response to a beryllium lymphocyte proliferation test. That's just a blood sample test where they take your blood, they expose it to beryllium. If you have a positive response, that means you've had exposure to beryllium in the past. What's really interesting about berylliosis is that you can have a genetic susceptibility to developing beryllium disease, and that is if you have this specific HLA allele, and that just involves one different amino acid at one location, and that will increase your risk of developing beryllium. What's different about berylliosis from sarcoidosis is that it's not usually a multi-system disease as sarcoidosis is. It usually only affects the lung and skin. So because of all this evidence that military exposures, especially in the Southwest Asia area, can contribute to the development of sarcoidosis, the PACT Act expanded VA health care and benefits to veterans exposed to burn pits and other toxic substances, and also Agent Orange as well. And so these benefits are available to military personnel who served in the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, or any other combat zone after 9/11. Sarcoidosis is a presumptive condition for veterans who served in the Gulf War and then anything after 9/11. So if that applies to you and you have sarcoidosis, then your care can be covered under the PACT Act. I just also want to talk briefly about federal compensation for beryllium disease. And that's why, it's important to distinguish between beryllium disease and sarcoidosis. If you were a Department of Energy employee, and these are employees who, helped build the nuclear weapons and bombs of the Cold War, if you were exposed and you were one of those workers, your compensation would include a lump sum of $150,000, ongoing medical treatment for your berylliosis, and sometimes there was even survivor compensation. So to summarize, there's military exposures could certainly be associated with sarcoidosis. We do see a higher incidence of sarcoidosis in the military, it seems. It's possible that some of this may be explained by beryllium exposure. And then we do have several federally recognized compensation programs in the military for sarcoidosis and also beryllium disease. Okay, so now I'm going to just finish with some other exposures, particularly infection and silica. So I think there's always been this theory that infections may contribute to the cause of sarcoidosis, and that's because a lot of studies have found evidence that there are microbial agents associated with granulomas in sarcoidosis. So studies have found bacterial and fungi components in granulomas. Also proteins from those bacteria and fungi will elicit an immune response in individuals with sarcoidosis. And this is interesting because this could explain why some occupations with a lot of interpersonal interactions may be more at risk for developing sarcoidosis. So how I mentioned that teachers, healthcare workers, people in administration tend to have a higher risk of sarcoidosis. And one thought is that maybe there is some transmissible pathogen that's being passed between individuals that can contribute to the development of sarcoidosis. However, against that theory is that antibiotics, so things that you would use to treat infection, really has not been shown to have any therapeutic benefit in sarcoidosis. But it is possible that these microbial exposures don't necessarily cause so much as an infection, but like a hypersensitivity reaction to the pathogens. So in that case, antibiotics wouldn't really help. It's more of like a allergic reaction, if you will. Several recent studies have also suggested a possible connection between silica and sarcoidosis. A lot of these studies are coming from Europe and Northern Europe specifically, and they show workers with the highest silica exposures also tend to have sarcoidosis. But this connection is not widely validated, so there's still a lot of work to be done with that association. But silicosis is a lung disease that results from silica exposure, and silica is just silicon dioxide, and that's what makes up sand and quartz. When this respirable silica gets into the lungs, it can produce pulmonary disease that can look a lot like sarcoidosis. You can have nodules, you can have large lymph nodes. Unfortunately, a lot of people who get diagnosed with silicosis never get lung biopsies because you don't need a lung biopsy to get diagnosed with silicosis. That is a disease of, they use the history to diagnose you, your history of exposure, and also lung imaging. And I think that's important because a recent study was showing that this study looked at 35 individuals with a history of silica exposure that happened to have lung biopsies, and they found in those individuals that a lot of them also had granulomas on pathology. So I wonder if we're missing some people with sarcoidosis and those who have been diagnosed with silicosis. And I think this has an important implication for treatment. In silicosis, there is no medical treatment. It's mostly just making sure you don't have any ongoing exposure to silica. But as you guys know from our previous lectures and your own personal experience in sarcoidosis, we have a lot of medications, most of them to suppress the immune system. And so I think this raises the question of whether or not immunosuppressive therapies that we use in sarcoidosis may be helpful in a disease like silicosis as well. So in summary of these slides, I just want to say that infectious agents could trigger sarcoidosis and may explain why some of those jobs with a lot of interpersonal interactions may be more at risk for sarcoidosis, and that silica exposure may also play a role in the development of sarcoidosis, but we need a lot more research in that area before anything definitive can be said. Okay, and that's my presentation. I'm open to questions and comments.
We are going to wrap up with some closing remarks from our two patient advisory board members, but I wanted to just review some final closing out statements, since I know everyone will probably be heading out before they leave. If you did not grab a parking ticket or a parking voucher when you checked in at registration, please make sure to grab one from our team out front. And we are giving out our direct number there just in case you have any issues in the parking garage. We always like to redirect you to our saysarcoidosis.org website to find out about future events, find out about our support group meetings, and learn how you can get more involved. Like Dr. Sharp mentioned, if you would like to be involved in our committees, learn how we can help with programming and different initiatives, please stop by the table back in the area where you ate and pick up a flyer on how to reach out to Ms. Robin, who's going to be giving our closing remarks on how to become more involved with our group. Okay, there we go, out in the front. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Robin and Chris to close out our day. Thank you.
Phew. As we conclude today's insightful program, we want to extend our heartfelt gratitude to all our distinguished speakers and panel members, Drs. Bonham, Montgomery, Obi, Azola, and Lynn, Dr. Stern, Dr. Chen, Dr. Birkenstock, Dr. Galotra, and Dr. Mathias. And Dr. Sharp. And Dr. Sharp. Thank you for sharing your invaluable expertise and your research with us today. We explored today the complexities of sarcoidosis from multiple perspectives, from the latest in genetic research to treatments to practical strategies for managing fatigue and understanding occupational exposures. We hope that you leave today with a sense of knowledge and empowerment. Sarcoidosis can be a lonely and an isolating disease, and today we came together to form a village. Sharing stories, exchanging information, and offering support creates community that helps to ease the feelings of isolation and provides a sense of purpose. And to continue building on that, we hope and invite you to join us at our support group and education sessions that are the first Monday of each month. Before we officially close, I want to extend thanks to the tireless work of our organizers. Where's Kayla? Can't do it without you, Kayla. And Larry. Is Larry even in here? And our entire team of volunteers who make this happen. And then to all of you, thank you for your participation. Thank you for your insightful questions and your curiosity and your shared passion for learning. You are the heart of this event. And until next time, Chris.
Thank you, Robin. When we did our YouTube video last year for sarcoidosis, when you watch the video, Many of us may have said it many different ways, hence say sarcoidosis. Because when we all first heard it from our doctors, I don't even know that our doctors knew how to pronounce it properly. We hadn't even heard of what it was. I remember after getting diagnosed and walking through the hallways of the VA that I'm walking through another room where someone was talking about it that very same day and didn't know what it was and was curious about it. And this was in 2021 before the PACT Act. So a huge appreciation for what the PACT Act brought about for all of us in 2022, for what it meant for us to refile and gain that awareness that this may have been or was likely, more likely than not, related to our time spent in the military. So that was fantastic. But there's still awareness that we don't have and that others don't have, that this is out there, that the PACT Act exists and there is help for veterans. So this is incredible how many of you are still here at the end of today. I think this is a testament for the amount of information and the talent that we had here today and the professionals that came out to speak on behalf of their patients. And we aren't just their patients here at Johns Hopkins, we are friends. Where have you been in a hospital or medical care establishment capacity where you felt that way about your care providers before? Nowhere, right? It's amazing, and I tell folks that if you really have something that you're serious about getting a resolution on, you just don't want to go to a doctor, that you really want to get the care that you need to find a solution that prolongs your life, you need to go to Johns Hopkins. So huge thank you for the level of effort that all of our teams go into here to try to find a cure for this. And what we're going to be doing in the future, as we will have some initiatives that start to reach more from the bottom up, from you all, boots on the ground. What's important? What studies would you like to see? What do you know that we don't know? Those are the things that we need to go after more so in the future than ever before, because for an illness, disease, etc., that was founded or discovered so long ago, we have to work harder, especially with advances in artificial intelligence to mine data, to start looking at data sets to find correlations, causation, and find what is triggering all this. And maybe we can prevent others from ever having to go through this experience. So with that, I appreciate all of y'all being here today and staying with us. And I hope that everybody takes away something today. And if you have any questions, some of us will still be here for a little while after the event. Feel free to come up and talk to us about anything you have. And thank you all for coming today, and we hugely appreciate it.